All right. So I am joined by Lan Hotchkiss, who is a Twitch, debate and politics kind of guy, but also is very interested in foreign policy. I want to show people the T-shirt you're wearing, Lance.
Sure. It says Solidarity, Not Sanctions, and it's a shirt from VenezuelaAnalysis.com, which is a favorite website of alternative news from Venezuela, favored by Noam Chomsky.
Fair enough. Okay, well, so this is you had suggested this debate to me, and I should say I think there is a good chance we're going to get a second guest. But they might be running a little late, which is mostly my fault about the getting the information to them. But want to start this up in the next few minutes. Do you you've definitely got your headphones plugged in, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is the audio okay? Any issues
I
with
just
that?
saw
Or?
somebody in the chat say there was a little bit of an echo, so I don't think that's me. Mine seems pretty solid, but anyway. Okay, well let's see if anybody else notices it going forward. But in any case, so you had suggested this, and I thought this would be interesting for a few reasons. I should say, this, even though it's extremely relevant, given everything that's happened, this is a debate that took place before Putin actually gave the order to invade Ukraine. And in fact, I was talking to Danny about it. Daniel Bessner, one of the two debaters, because he's a colleague at Jacobin and a good friend. And I like to come into these things fresh. Not everybody does. That's fine. So I have not seen this yet, but I was like, hey, it's like, do you guys talk about whether or not the invasion is going to happen? And he said, yeah, I mean, I do. At the very end, I say that it probably won't, but I could be wrong. So, he's willing to take the hit on this, on us watching, despite the fact that he says that at the end. To be fair, I think not everybody, right? There were people who were saying it would happen, but I also don't think the people who did say it would happen deserve a lot of credit for foresight there. I mean, I
Couldn't
think,
agree more. Yeah.
yeah.
And I mean, even who is it? The Gravel Institute
Mm-hmm.
basically, had to come out and apologize. But they were saying, hey, we were going off of what the Ukrainian government was saying, and as recently as, let's say, 2 weeks ago, time frame could be imprecise there, but as recently as a few days before the invasion, they were saying that they had no evidence or reason to believe that it was happening. President Biden, please stop tearing our economy apart with this, saber rattling, like war speech, type of thing.
Yeah, that was bizarre, right? That it was this extremely unusual situation where the United States was saying Russia was about to invade Ukraine. Ukraine was saying, calm down, that's not going to happen. And then it became an even, which is usually the opposite of what you'd expect, right? That like a small country, I'm not geographically small, but, a minor power, right? Let's say that, is actually downplaying the threat that's posed to it. While its great power ally is played it up. I mean, that is not at all how this usually works. And the situation became even stranger when the invasion actually happened. And I think that, so I think from what I understand, so again, I already mentioned one of our debaters here is my friend Danny Bessner, who is a contributing editor at Jacobin. He's a fellow at the Quincy Institute, which promotes peace and diplomacy and other things that these days make you Chamberlain at Munich in the eyes of much of not only Twitter, the mainstream media. Anybody who watched the State of the Union the other night saw there were actually congressmen and senators chanting USA, USA. So that's kind of what the atmosphere has been like. But then, and he's the author of a bunch of books. Democracy in Exile is one of them. And then, how would you describe Vaush?
I mean, he self-describes as like an anarchist, socialist type, but I think that in certain instances, and very recently, and with respect to the Ukraine and NATO situation, he's definitely more on like the liberal centrist type of side of things.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So, I mean, I've had exactly one conversation with the guy. It was like a couple of years ago, I think, at this point, to argue about class reductionism. But yeah, it was, because I remember it was before the 2020 election. Yeah, so I think that it would be fair. I don't think it would be describing him in any way he wouldn't describe himself to say what you just said, right? Because I think I've seen him kind of play with that a little bit. Like he'll use these sort of playful expressions like anarcho-Bidenism
He's
and
done anarcho-NATOism now. And I mean, it seems like it's kind of like spite baiting or something like that, because he knows that it's going to upset a lot of people further to the left than him. But
yeah,
maybe he's really playing around with that idea and that belief, and just wants to put it as like a sarcastic meme belief before he adopts it truly as his own firm position. Potentially anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think that it is true that he has some unusual combinations of positions. Like in some ways, not without precedent. Like, look, I love Noam Chomsky, but I mean, Chomsky's kind of an anarcho-social democrat, in terms of his combination of positions. And I think Vaush, certainly in terms of foreign policy, right, is probably much less radical than someone like Chomsky at this point. I think that.
Well, he's.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to point out he's on a lot of occasions when talking about the Russian political tensions and the situation. He's called for wrecking Russia, economically, and all that comes with that. And definitely that's more of a centrist position. And
definitely,
yeah. I mean, obviously sanctions comes with that, but sanctions are going to target the civilians first and foremost. The oligarchs are going to be more or less fine. Their standard of living, they're going to be provided for. So anyway, sorry, that's kind of immaterial to talk about.
No, I think
Vaush
it is.
his view.
I think it is worth pointing out, right? So, like, what we were trying to do the last couple of minutes is fairly characterize Vaush, which I do want to try to do, because I think, I think both of us are fairly hostile to his position on this stuff. So I didn't want to just come into this ripping him. I wanted to try to give, a fair description of where he's coming from. Oh, thank you for that, Adonish. I appreciate that. I actually had a friend tell me there was this like totally apolitical person from like his parents' church who was like, "Oh, you work for Jacobin, right? I saw your friend Ben at Joe Rogan. I like that." But in any case, I think, yeah, I mean, look, my normative position I think is probably pretty similar to yours, right? I mean, I'll just kind of lay out mine real quick, and then you can do yours, and before too much longer, we can actually start watching the debate. But I would say, right, that my starting point, and this is going to sound really, really simple-minded, but bear with me here, is that war is really bad, and that and that the one thing that's worse than a sort of regional war would be a world war that could possibly wipe out the human race. That would be very bad. And coming from those two premises, I was very sympathetic to Bernie Sanders' call in The Guardian for sort of all out kind of everything on the table negotiations to stop things from escalating to this point in the first place. And I know some people hear that as, oh, you're making excuses for Putin or whatever, but I think that's just kind of asinine. I think that you could say that what Putin has done is indefensible, which I think it is, but also say that peace negotiations are good, right? And there are any number of issues ranging from the civil war that has been going on in Ukraine since 2014, which I think the more you start to look into that, the more that complicates the kind of narrative.
Oh,
that you get right now. I mean, I was since I hate myself, I listened to a few minutes of Fox News on Sirius on my way back from the doctor's office today, and they were referring to Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, as Churchill in a T-shirt. So that's sort of the frame that I think a lot of people have applied to this. I think there's a lunatic fringe of the Western left that has applied the opposite frame. Everybody in Ukraine is a Nazi, and so it's World War II in the other direction. But I think that by far the dominant frame is it's World War II in that direction. That if you think that there's like anything that's gone on from 2014 to 2022 that's more complicated than valiant democracy under peril, then you're a Putin apologist. And I think that's kind of ridiculous, right? So that's the first thing. I think that, like, in terms of things like, the status of Crimea, the status of even those, and yes, they are absolutely authoritarian puppet states, but also in terms of the local politics, a lot of people in those places would not want to be reintegrated back into Ukraine, the separatist so-called people's republics, and NATO membership, etc. I think there are a lot of things that could be negotiated on, and that negotiation. What's the phrase? Talkie is better than
Bomby or
something like that. We're butchering it, but it's along those lines. Jaw is better than war. That's what I was thinking of. That's the classic line about negotiations and war, and I think that's right. I think that. If people want to know a lot more details about this, I do a show on Callin. I've interviewed Cuba Rosinski, who knows a lot about this stuff, like 3 times. And I think that would be my position on before. Now, given those same 2 premises that I started with, I think Putin actually launching a full-scale invasion of the country is an absolutely insane escalation. And it's criminal in a lot of the same ways that, the wars that, the United States waged in the Middle East were criminal. And even to your point earlier about sanctions, I mean, I think it's, look, in a certain sense, people will clip this out of context. I'm a defender of whataboutism, by which I mean that I think it's totally acceptable when one country does thing to ask yourself, what about similar things that other countries have done, and how would you feel in the parallel situation? I think that that's a useful sort of check for moral consistency. And so, on the one hand, I do think mainstream politicians are incredibly hypocritical about this stuff. If Mexico tried to enter into a military alliance with China, the United States wouldn't stand for it, and the same thing might happen. But also, I'd be 100% against that war. And so, I feel nothing but love and solidarity for the anti-war movement in Russia. At the same time, though. And also, I will say, right? I mean, I think this is as much as I would give to the Vaush sort of position, but I would give this much. If I think back to 2003, look, if rival powers had been in a position to do this in 2003, and they had done like targeted sanctions on individual politically connected billionaires in the United States, that they were going to like seize foreign assets of Halliburton or of Donald Rumsfeld to as a pressure tactic to get the United States to withdraw from Iraq, I'd be for that, right? So I'm fine with doing the same to Russian oligarchs. But I do agree with what you said earlier. I think that like actual sort of widespread sanctions that just make ordinary Russians who don't get to set foreign policy miserable is not something I'd at all be for. And I think that anybody who wants, like, there are all these calls for Biden to like set up a no-fly zone in Ukraine, which is just insane Curtis LeMay shit. Look it up. Like that could literally end the human race. Don't do that.
Yeah. The English translation of having a no-fly zone is we need to have American planes shooting down Russian planes in Ukrainian airspace, and this will definitely set off World War III, or at least some further extreme escalation that we do not want to invite, for sure.
At the very least, get us a hell of a lot closer to World War III. My friend Nando Vila, and it would certainly risk it. I mean, my friend Nando Vila recommended a while ago Robert Caro's biography. It's a big multi-volume biography of LBJ. It's not completely done yet. And I've been going through those for the last year. And I just got to the part of the last one about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it's uncomfortable reading right now. I think Yeah, I think that the idea of the United States to shoot down Russian planes over Ukraine or be in a position of doing so is completely insane and incredibly dangerous to even to even contemplate. Right? I mean that's. I mean, I don't,
Yeah.
look, I think that the, invasion of Panama was an indefensible crime, but I wouldn't have wanted Gorbachev to, to trigger the possibility of nuclear, global thermonuclear war over it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll just thank you for that, and
Right.
I'll lay out my position. I'll try and get as
Sure.
much out of the way as I can. So, on your point about sanctions, I see sanctions as a wrecking ball, which is used from a stronger country and even the bloc of countries to destroy the economy of weaker countries. But in the same time, as they're doing that, they're also weakening their own economy. The reason that sanctions are usually given is humanitarian and civil rights violations and whatnot, but the actual effects of the sanctions don't actually do anything to ameliorate those specific human rights concerns. Obviously, negotiations would do a lot more towards that
Right.
effect. And all right, let's see what else. So I would see sanctions absolutely as an act of war. A lot of people don't, but
Right.
I would say that economic warfare is just as real as military warfare. Further, I mean, to the Cuban Missile Crisis situation and the military alliance situation, I don't see at all that if there was a Cuban Missile Crisis Part 2 in Mexico or in Canada or let's say in Hawaii, where we took their land, we brought it into the United States so we could have pineapples and such. And if we put missiles in Hawaii and the Russians built a base in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, that would be underwater in a heartbeat. The U.S. would absolutely not stand for that. And obviously, like random sanctions, like I saw that there was Gambit, the esports team, being sanctioned from competition. There was the pulling of Russian vodka. There was a famous Philharmonic Russian composer in the UK that was actually sacked for not saying anything. He was demanded that he speak out against the Russian invasion and aggression. And obviously, it's true that what they've done is a dramatic escalation of everything. But he refused to say anything, and so he was sacked. Just not, and this is the liberal bastions of free speech and not compelled speech and all this kinds of things that people are saying and doing these kinds of things. So I think that it really shows how fragile liberal democracy really is when it comes to crisis situations like this. And even on the ground in Ukraine, Ukraine itself is not a bastion of liberal democracy. The coup in 2014, the coup in 2004, those were extreme provocations by the United States towards a red line that they knew, that they were warned about since, as early as 94, as 98, George Kennan. And I mean, I think that when your standard liberal in the United States is further to the right than somebody like Pat Buchanan and Henry
Mm-hmm.
Kissinger, who famously, advised, hey, we should make it so that Ukraine is a neutral state. We're John Mearsheimer. We're sending Ukraine down the primrose path, and what's going to result from it is the wrecking of Ukraine. And I mean, obviously, this is an imperialist versus imperialist, or irredentist, if you will, war between there are no good actors in this conflict. And there's bringing up the unsavory tactics of arming neo-Nazis. And obviously, there's neo-Nazis on Russian side too, so there's no
Yeah, but
relevance towards that. But I
yeah,
mean,
it is worth
I would just
pointing
say there's
out
no
that
good actors.
yeah, well, 100% on that. And it is worth pointing out when I was talking to Kuba earlier tonight in Callin, like he put this very well, right? Which is just to say, and yeah, this is true about both Russia and Ukraine, right? That they both do have neo Nazis who they have their militaries have worked with. That we wouldn't. Yeah, sure, there are Nazis in many countries, and sometimes they do awful things, Charlottesville, but we wouldn't have like a Nazi militia that was just
Yeah,
integrated into like, oh, the 82nd Airborne will be the Nazi division now,
yeah.
and that is the kind of thing that both these countries have done to varying extents, which so
And
yeah.
if I can just make one last point really quick, I think this is very important because this kind of goes into not just the history, but the contemporary state of affairs on the ground. In Crimea, they're having massive water issues. Their reservoirs were down to 7%. In the Donbass, their electricity systems and their water systems have been targeted. UNICEF has reported over 400 targeting of water systems since 2016. And obviously, when your electricity and your water are cut off, that is a crime against humanity. That's that's an attack against the civilian infrastructure. That's not a valid military target. And what obsessed me the most is the mixing, the kind of gray, the vanishing of the gray line between military and civilian attacks and legitimacy in this conflict.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, no, it is. I mean, it is just god awful, and this is. I mean, again, I think that the party obviously most responsible is the Russian government. They're the ones who did this. I mean, there is a reason why most analysts who weren't working for a government said no, they're not going to do this, right? Because even from a perspective of imperial self-interest, I think it's a crazily self-destructive thing to do. I mean, like, just in terms of the effect of the Russian economy, in terms of like even the goal of stopping NATO expansion. Right now, other countries are going to want to join NATO for obvious reasons. But I don't necessarily take the further leap from that many people do and say, oh, see, so the real goals can't have anything to do with those things. Like, no, sometimes empires are just incredibly self-destructive. I mean, if you recall, the United States just finished like a 20-year war in Afghanistan that it's very unclear what we got out of, even from a perspective of cynical imperial self-interest.
And on the way out, we froze the bank assets and said, hey, half of these are going to 9/11 victims now. Can't support that. I mean, that's leading to a resurgence of the mass, a huge humanitarian crisis. And obviously pointing out Yemen, pointing out Israel, pointing out Somalia, wars going on there, denying of, humanitarian aid and basic necessities.
Yeah, absolutely. Somebody asked about this in the chat, so I'm going to try to do 30 seconds on this because I really want to get to the actual debate. But in terms of the extent to which, I mean, everybody knows, obviously, Russia's a very authoritarian state, but the extent to which Ukraine right now is a particularly democratic state, I think, is more complicated than a lot of people think, in that in 2014, there was you used the word coup earlier. A lot of people on the left do that, and I think there's some truth to that. I think it also did definitely, in many ways, have the quality of a popular uprising, but it was against a democratically elected, corrupt and bad, but democratically elected pro-Russian government in 2014. That the response to this, again, elected government being deposed, is that there was a lot of everything that's happened since then, say in the last 8 years. And I would just say that it is true that Zelensky, the current president, won a real election, right? I mean, I don't think anybody seriously maintains that was rigged or anything like that. But that's also after, the country's been in a state of civil war, and much of the pro-Russian areas of the country, have left or, been annexed in the case of Crimea, or whatever. And so I think it's a real election, but it's a real election held under weird circumstances. That's also a successor to the overthrow of the previous government. None of which is to say that, I think people on Twitter who think everybody in the Ukraine's, everybody in Ukraine's a Nazi, and and Putin is the reincarnation of Vladimir Lenin, who, by the way.
Putler.
No, but well, that's the opposite view, right? Is that he's Putler, right? But
no, he's a hybrid. They found a way to mix the DNA together between Stalin and Hitler, and they injected it right up into Putin. And he said, "Now I got to go rebuild the Tsarist Empire and the Soviet Union put together." But
we are about to start. I will say our other guest has showed up in the green room here, so we'll introduce him and also give him a chance to confirm that is in fact how Vladimir Putin was created. So,
hi everyone. I'm good. Can you guys hear me?
Yep, yes. We can hear you. You want to tell everybody who you are?
My name is Shakit. I'm a postdoctoral fellow doing international relations. I did my doctorate at University of Toronto, where I got, I did my focus on IR, and I take a critical political economy and, critical international relations perspective. And I'm really interested in the neoliberalization of, economies in Europe, Latin America, and Africa. So, and I've had a couple run-ins with Vaush on this topic, as you may have heard. I debated him twice, or had a chat and then debated him the first time. So, yeah, I have a, quite a bit of a perspective in terms of, this current conflict and, his the lens he uses to, examine these issues.
All right. Well, I do want to get to the debate itself, but before you came on, Lance was about to make a point.
Yeah, I was just going to point out that, to the point of whether Ukraine is a liberal bastion of democracy and democratic values, as soon as the new opposition party, took hold of government, they banned the Russian, or put forward to ban the Russian language, which actually happened in 2019. And they also banned the Communist Party of Ukraine. And, for as much of things you can say about Putin, at least his biggest opposition party in Russia is the Communist Party. So
yeah, how much of an opposition party is that, though? I've heard different things about that.
I'm not exactly sure myself, but I know that when he was giving his speech before the invasion, after the recognition of the so-called People's Republics, he the part about Lenin, talking about Lenin in relation to Ukraine, that was directly about, directed towards the Communist Party in Russia to kind of try and ostracize them and push them aside so that he could maintain power. And the speech was more or less called the three betrayals, the betrayal by the communists, and I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think his name is Milo Brankovic. He's an IMF inequality expert, and he kind of summed it up in that way.
Okay, so my understanding had been that the Communist Party in recent history have been Putin allies, but maybe he's worried about them becoming actual, like a real serious opposition. I'm not, I couldn't speak to that. Oh, okay. Hey guys, we should start. We've been want to get through this, so let's do it.
Do you both want to give just a quick introduction to yourselves so I can adjust the volume levels? Maybe we'll start with you, Daniel.
Yeah, sure. So my name's Daniel Bessner. I'm an associate professor at the University of Washington. I've also written for venues like Jacobin, N+1, and in the 2020 primary, I was on the Bernie Sanders foreign policy team, sort of the group of advisors that were helping him develop foreign policy.
Sounds good, Vaush.
Well, geez, I didn't do any of that. I'm Vaush, and I have a YouTube channel. So so now I get to talk about this and have my voice listened to by an enormous number of people with no official, education on the subject.
Nice.
Well, that sounds great. So we're going to be having a conversation about U.S. foreign policy. It's going to be relatively unguided. I don't think I'll be having to do too much moderation, as you both are very professional individuals. And basically, I'll just probably serve to steer the conversation in a direction if things tend to get a little loopy. We're going to try and limit it to an hour, hour and a half, at which point we'll do about 30 minutes of audience Q&A. So please, audience, if you're watching this, any of you have any questions, jump into the Search.tv chat or the YouTube chat and at me, and then we'll try to keep track of the best ones. And there's no paywall, so don't worry, you don't have to do a super chat to get your question heard in any way, shape, or form. And then I guess with that, why don't we open with Daniel? Why don't you express some of the things you want to discuss?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for setting this up. Really do appreciate it. And I also should have mentioned I'm the co-host of a foreign policy podcast called American Prestige. If anyone wants to check that out, please do, where you find podcasts. So I guess my general proposition is that I think the United States should essentially draw down its empire. What do I mean by its empire? Presently, as probably everyone listening is vaguely aware, at least the United States spends an enormous amount on its military, between 750 and 800 trillion dollars. We have 750 overseas military bases. Essentially, the global reserve currency is the American dollar. And I think that if one looks at the history of the actually existing American empire, which I would date to roughly World War II. Of course, the United States has always been an expansionist power, starting with East Coast settlement, moving west, going further during the War of 1898 to take literal colonies in the Philippines and Puerto Rico. And in fact, today, some people might not know the United States actually has control of 5 populated colonies: Puerto Rico, Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and I'm blanking on the last one, American Samoa. So we are a colonial power in that sense, but even more than that, we have this sort of global presence. And I would say when you look at the history of what the United States has done abroad as a whole, we've actually done more damage to the world than good. I think what the US did in Europe, in Western Europe, was a general good. It basically ended war in Western and Central Europe for much of the post-1945 period. But when you look at the global South, I think what you see is a series of attempted coups, some of which succeeded, most of which, whether they succeeded or not, caused enormous damage. You could point to the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran, the overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz, Allende, participation in the Indonesian genocide in the 1960s. So the U.S. has really done enormous damage, in addition to what people listening might be more familiar with, like the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, the intervention in Libya. So I would say, I think as an American citizen, someone who has a voice in this country, it's my duty to essentially try to restrain U.S. foreign policy, because on balance, as I said, I think it's done more damage to the world. There are larger claims I can make that are essentially philosophical about the ability of an outside power to really know what's going on in another country, which is based on intelligence, which is based on particular types of access. But I'll let it stand there that on the whole, the U.S. has done more harm than good in the world.
And I waiting patiently for Lance to step in and give me permission to talk. Now realize, of course, that a casual conversation doesn't need that. So a lot of what you said, I just flatly agree with in terms of U.S. empire and the harm that we've done to the world. The broad strokes of the matter, that is to say that we should begin the process of, obviously we can't just do this, like I can't single-handedly, but it would be nice if we drew down the military budget, if we reduced the number of military bases we had abroad, if we prioritized interdependence with other nations through mutually beneficial trade agreements rather than through neocolonial exploitation, through deposing democratically elected leaders in favor of autocrats who are more amenable to American business interests. There are a great many things that we're doing that we should stop. I guess the things that concern me is that there are fine details that I don't fully understand in terms of how we could affect the least harm or the most good. So, for example, neocolonialism is bad. The IMF and the World Bank are bad. Hopefully not hot takes here. But the fact remains that in spite of how terrible they are, there are also several countries, a good many countries, only lifelines to any reasonable trade bloc currently. Of course, if we keep people in sweatshops, that's terrible. But if the alternative is absolute destitution, this is very much a, should we be thanking the father who makes the orphan and keep them in the filled basement as opposed to letting them be out in the street type deal? We're dealing with two different flavors of terrible outcome. And I don't mean to suggest that any outcome here is, at least within the available range of things we can expect might happen. good. None of them are good. When we cede power, Russia and China expand. I don't know if they're necessarily any better than us. In fact, I'm quite disfavorable towards them. When we disassociate ourselves economically from countries which are dependent, it would be nice if they could do some, the four tigers of Southeast Asia, protectionist policy, rise themselves up from nothing type deal. But of course, there are other neo-colonial empires that'll remains. At this point, in the situation we live in right now, I don't know what practical steps we can take to actually go about reducing American power, engaging in decolonization. And sometimes the conversations that I have with people online lead me to believe other people don't actually care about any of those things. They just don't like American power. Like with this Russia-Ukraine situation, decolonization is when we don't give armaments to Ukraine when they want them, but is when we allow Russia to invade Ukraine, which they very unambiguously do not want, and other stuff like that. The Belt and Road Initiative is maybe a bit better put together than how we typically run our neo-colonial projects. I acknowledge that, but it's not as though China, if given the same power and prominence, wouldn't do exactly what we do, sometimes worse, sometimes better, on a global stage. And we know Russia has to resort to even worse methods because they don't have the economy to engage in neocolonialism the way we do. They have to invade, which is scary. And it means they have to push themselves up against NATO borders, and that threatens war, real war, potentially global disastrous war. I'm asking you, because I want an answer to these questions. In practical steps, what can we do? What decisions can we make? Positions can we advocate for that aren't just going to leave a power vacuum open to other groups?
I mean, I think those are great questions, and those are basically the right questions. If one considers oneself to be a moral person, these are things that one has to take seriously, particularly if one identifies broadly on the left and sort of the moral politics of that. I think probably a disagreement we have is that I don't view international relations as a sphere in which there are vacuums that are automatically filled. I think this is something that Americans do. We do view it that way, and we actually impute other motivations, or really our motivations, onto other powers. And the prime example.
So I was literally just typing in the private chat. We should wait a few minutes before we stop because they haven't really said anything yet. But I did just want to stop to say that that is a really good and important point that Danny just made there. That this is a really flawed assumption that it's either that the United States is the undisputed global hegemon, or like China will become the undisputed global hegemon, that those are the only choices.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a big error in reasoning, and I think it's the language of moral panic. McCarthyite, if you're not with us, you're against us type of thing. And we see it a lot of people who are neutral towards the situation being accused of being Putin puppets and pro-Putin, when they can literally make the statement, Russia has genuine security interests, next to the statement, Putin and Russia are bad and horrible, but they have a point. And it's a situation of two things can be right at once, all over again.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think this type of thinking is what led, Vaush to some very spurious claims when he talks about Ukraine specifically, saying that Yanukovych was just a puppet of Putin. I mean, he can't see it as being just, a flawed government, which was democratically elected, which was corrupt, but which had the backing of, Eastern Ukraine, at least, or a segment of the Ukrainian population. And, when he talks about it, he just views it as Vladimir Putin's puppet that was overthrown through a democratic revolution, ignoring the fact that most of the violence we now know was initiated by the far right in Ukraine. So, I mean, it's this type of thinking that leads to that type of flawed analysis, specifically when he's talking about Ukraine later on, I think, or at least it came up in our debate.
Including the sniper attacks, too.
Exactly, right.
So do you want to fill people in a little bit on what you're referring to there?
Sure. So during the crescendo, the height of the Euromaidan protests, towards the end of February, I think it was 21st or 20th, but there was sniper fire coming down and killing protesters, and they were killing them by the dozens. But not only were they killing protesters, they were also killing police. And there was a tapped phone call which came out called the Ashcroft-Payette phone call, where it was pointed out that it was determined, and there's lots of studies and corroborating evidence for this, that the bullets which killed the police are the same bullets which killed the protesters, and that the snipers were on the coup side. I'll say coup. We could say popular uprising. I prefer to say coup. But the point is that this was blamed on Yanukovych before any evidence could come out, before any investigations could be done. And so he agreed to a power sharing agreement. But the night that he agreed to that agreement, there was a defiant speech given by one of the leaders of the protest, basically saying, "This is not good enough. We need you out. We're going to kick you out of power if we can't get you out of power diplomatically. And this needs to happen right now." And the very next day, Yanukovych fled the country. This was February 22nd, I believe. And he did so while there were snipers waiting outside to shoot and kill him if he attempted to flee. And he was able to escape. And now he's in exile in Russia.
Yeah, and I can also just add, sorry.
No, please.
Okay, I was going to just say, in case anybody thinks that this is conspiratorial, there's an academic at the University of Ottawa, Ivan Kachanovsky, who actually has done field work. And so everything that was just said is based on, an evaluation of forensics, interviewing survivors, interviewing witnesses, and determining through that type of, piecing together of evidence that, in fact, the gunfire did not come from the security forces, at least not primarily. It came from segments that were embedded with the protesters. And one reason he points out that they had an incentive to do this is because the United States had stated that once the death toll or the casualties reach a certain number, the United States and the West would be inclined to recognize the new government. So clearly there was an incentive here for, far-right elements who carried out the coup to actually, shoot security forces and protesters and try to blame that on Yanukovych. So that should be kept in mind. This has been published in peer-reviewed journals and presented at, political science conferences. So it's not just some, fringe groups on the internet that are saying this. It's based on some solid evidence at this point.
Okay, yeah. I guess I can't comment one way or the other about that, but what's the easiest way for anybody who wants to check for themselves to look into this?
Sorry, Canadian Dimension has a good article on this called "The Hidden Origin of the Escalating Ukraine-Russia Conflict," and there you can actually find the links and the sources to the actual research that's been published and presented on this particular topic. The Jacobin also ran a piece on this. I think it was a U.S. backs a far-right coup. There's an article in that publication where they also go over this and talk about the fact that there is some compelling evidence, that most of the gunfire didn't come from the security forces. So people can certainly check those sources and then find sources to the additional information there. Gotcha. I don't know if Lance wants to add to that. But...
No, I thought I would let you take it away. So
okay, well that's okay. I think this is probably what you're talking about. It's so I guess actually, so this is an article from a few weeks ago that's by Branko Marcetic, who has certainly been a guest here several times, called "A U.S.-backed far-right-led revolution in Ukraine helped bring the U.S. to the brink of war." Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, that's the one from the Jacobin that I was just referencing. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, all right. Now I feel better about that. I think I trust Branko to be diligent, about repeating something like that. So yeah, I do just want to circle back, and obviously we've watched like 5 minutes. We need to do more time than this between interruptions, or we're not going to get through this. But I do just want to like kind of circle and underline that point, right? I mean that Lance described it very harshly, but however you want to describe it, I think it's just not a reasonable assumption that either the United States is going to be running the world as the global hegemon or some other power like China would. I mean, I think just in terms of what the aspirations are of different states, what the realistic capacities are of different states, I think the idea that something like equivalent to the current US-led world order would just fall into place as soon as we stop doing this, I don't think is a reasonable assumption. And thank you so much, HFO, for the super sticker. Okay, sorry. So this is my fault. I stopped way too soon. I did just want to kind of jump on that and highlight that. But let's keep watching.
example of that, what I would say is George Kennan's long telegram of February 1946. So what is that? So people might have heard of the grand strategy of containment, which is what the United States followed during the Cold War. In different forms, but broadly speaking, that was true, which was the idea is that you contain the Soviet Union, especially when it comes to moving past Eastern Europe into Central and Western Europe. This was the US strategy. And this strategy was first articulated in 1946 by a guy named George Kennan. And what Kennan argued, essentially, was that Marxism-Leninism was an ideology that had global and universalist aspirations, and that it was necessarily expansionist, that no matter what would happen, the Soviet Union viewed itself as having a world historical mission that encompassed the globe. I would say a couple of things there. I would say that when one actually digs into the archives of what was happening in the Soviet Union in the 40s, 50s, you look at the work of someone like Vladislav Zubak, who's really the guy who did this, is that that's actually not the case. And the Soviet Union pretty early on didn't really have this sort of total expansionist vision of self. What was happening, I think at least, was that someone like Kennan was actually imputing a universalistic, an American universalism onto the Soviet Union, because I do think this country has baked into its DNA a type of Protestant universalism, this idea of being a city on a hill, the idea that expressed by someone like Woodrow Wilson and to a lesser degree FDR is that global peace and prosperity depends on the world following American ideas. I don't think other powers actually believe that. So take the Belt and Road Initiative. I think that though China did have some intention of winning over the global South, I don't think the initiative approached what the United States has done in terms of development aid, in terms of winning supposedly the hearts and minds of the global South onto its side. I don't think China has genuinely global aspirations. I would say the same for Russia. I would say what both China and Russia do have is regional aspirations. I think they both want to be hegemonic in their region. China wants to be hegemonic in East Asia. Russia wants to be hegemonic in broadly Eastern Europe, however you want to define that. And they don't want the United States to be the regional hegemon there, which it is now. And so we could talk about that, you know, who would suffer under Chinese hegemony or Russian hegemony. And I think, Vaush, you're right. It's not going to be peaches and cream for everyone. But it is, I think, important to start from the base that these are wants and desires that great powers have. Like, for example, as the United States announced in the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, it wanted to control the Western Hemisphere, and it does. Now, that's not something I support. I don't think the United States should be hegemonic throughout the entire Western Hemisphere, but it is, and this is what great powers want. So I'm not sure if naturalness is the right word, but at least if one has strategic empathy, one understands why the modern Russian Federation has memories of German land invasion and French land invasion going back centuries and wants a security buffer. So I just think that's something to understand. Now, the question that I think you asked, which is a good one, is what are the steps one takes, right? I think you have to think in time horizons, and I think history provides a guide. And this is often the question that arises in humanitarian intervention. You know, there's a genocide happening. Shouldn't the United States, which is a superpower, intervene in that genocide to stop innocent people from dying, right? This is an argument, and I think it's an argument that a lot of people who were morally coherent made over the course, particularly of the 90s and 2000s. It's faded a bit from the scene, but I think it allows us to get into this question. So what I would say is that if one is thinking in a medium-term time horizon, the sheer fact of the matter is that if you want to dismantle the empire, you can't really have the capabilities to intervene in that way, to pick winners, to decide who's on the right side of history, who's not on the right side of history. So that's going to result in some short-term harm. I think that's absolutely true, and it's something to really think about and take seriously. But if one believes that ultimately, as leftists, and this is really my argument, you have to focus on the structure of empire, you're going to have to make some very difficult short-term decisions in order to create a type of world that you want to see in the medium and long term. And it'll be a difficult world, and it'll be one that is by no means perfect. But I think that is really how we should be thinking about it. We shouldn't always focus on the type of moment of intervention, which is what we tend to do in the United States for a variety of reasons, a lot having to do with the nature of our media. But we need to focus on these sort of larger structures and these long-term time horizons.
Thank you for that,
just
NF.
to wrap up here, it's just my opinion that the United States should really stop intervening, should stop choosing winners abroad, because I would say history has demonstrated that it oftentimes get things wrong. So let me just with this statistic. So, for example, during the Cold War, the U.S. tried to overthrow regimes 67 times, and it succeeded about 25 times. And even when it didn't succeed, it often resulted in quote unquote authoritarian outcomes, bad outcomes. And I would point people to the book titled Covert Regime Change by Lindsay O'Rourke. So I would just say history has demonstrated that those interventions don't really do what they're supposed to do most of the time. And that if we want to create a more just world, we actually have to decrease the empire, lower the budget, get rid of the bases, and just stop intervening in the politics of other areas and regions of the world.
I feel like, so I disagree with almost everything that you've said in some form or another here. So I'm glad we
Wow.
centered on this quickly. In terms of the perceived global ambitions of other geopolitical powers, I understand that regional hegemony is something that Russia and China are more likely to aim for now because they're not capable of global hegemony like we are. But I think that's changing. Russia doesn't have its reach around the globe, not anymore at least. But China isn't just looking at Southeast Asia. They've invested heavily in the development of Africa, which is hardly their geopolitical space. And they also have kept decently close ties with some of the more social democratic leaderships in South America. I imagine because to those groups, siding with China as a broader, global power is preferable to America, given America's history with social democrats in Latin America. Can't blame them, but I don't understand what would deprioritize global domination for these groups. It's just a matter of what you can actually achieve. There are parts of the world that are off limits, of course. Nobody's going to take a nuclear power, for example. That's just essentially off the table. Countries that don't have nuclear armaments, though, feel like they're open to kind of colonial or neo-colonial grabs that we've been engaging in for centuries. Other countries now are starting to catch up on. It seems like, if anything, there's this compensation because America currently isn't annexing any territory. It doesn't seem like a thing we have an interest in, thank God, but China can, and Russia is. They're making up for lost time, and I don't think they're only interested in their regions. I think they're interested in what they can take, and what they can take will be determined by how much power they have to actually affect. Even with the Soviet Union, you had the Trotskyist global communist revolution approach versus Stalin's more protectionist communism within the Soviet Union attitude. But the attitude of Stalinist Soviet Union was, to build out a power block, a Soviet power block, and wait for the capitalist world to fall. And one of the reasons why, these goals are inseparable, this global political influence, is because we're all fighting over resources now, right? Eastern Ukraine has natural gas resources that Russia desperately wants to control itself, and definitely does not want the West to have just free access to. There are, rare earth minerals in parts of Africa and Latin America that would be crucially beneficial for any domestic production. I don't think there's any reason that a country would only want to control its territory. Like, everyone wants the world. It's just a matter of how good they are at it, right? And in terms of the anti-interventionism, I feel like we're lumping a lot together potentially. Like, there's a very broad range of behaviors that we're consolidating down into interventionism. So I agree, for example, because you put coups in there. I'm not going to defend coups or deposing democratically elected leaders or anything like that, unless it's Putin. I have to stand up to my spicy Twitter clips. But in terms of like backing the winner, there isn't just like a losing and a winning side and what's going to happen in Ukraine. There's a right or a wrong side. And in this case, we're not talking about deposing leaders or anything. We're talking about supplying armaments that they want, that the population supports. So it's not just like an isolated power grab either, because America doesn't stand to like annex the territory afterwards. It's to all of Europe's interest, essentially, that Russian expansionism not allow them to get any closer to the current like NATO line. So if it seems to me like there are going to be tough decisions we have to make if we want to reduce our role as the world police, but sometimes I feel like our participation isn't just like humanitarian intervention. It's just people of the world sticking up to a potentially bad outcome. And in this case, I think that we're right to try to keep Russia's hands off Ukraine by supplying them arms, or potentially sanctioning Russia as a deterrent or a punishment for engaging in that behavior, because they have to not do that. It would be good if they could stop doing that, ideally.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot there, and I think that's pretty thoughtful. So I think one thing I would say is that.
All right. Well, it's probably a good time to stop and comment. You guys have anything to start us off?
Sure. Yeah, I was taking some notes, kind of going crazy at the end there, but he was saying, I mean, he exactly reiterated Danny's point there. Everyone wants the world, which is exactly what he said, which is imposing U.S. values onto others and assuming that they share your own values when they're a completely different culture, and that might not necessarily be true. It's just an assumption here. The same thing has gone for when he's had conversations on autonomy and decolonization, and it's the same kind of, in my view, reactionary kind of thing to Black Lives Matter, where it's kind of, if we give up our power, now the Black people are going to do what we did to them, and that's how he's kind of viewing it with respect to Russia and China. And sorry, it might be a weird example, but he said the U.S. is an annexing territory. And that might be technically true, but after the 2014 coup, Yatsenyuk, who was handpicked by Victoria Nuland, he said, he came hat in hand to the American billionaires, the oligarchs, and he said, "Please buy Ukraine." And this was and 1 month after the coup, the IMF had already agreed to a $27 billion loan to Ukraine, and the complete privatization of the country. It was what led who is it, Eric Prince, I think it was, to almost ink a $10 billion deal to purchase the Ukraine Air Force, privatizing a country's entire Air Force. It's almost unthinkable. But I mean, he thinks there's a right and wrong side to this. I mean, obviously one side is going to be more right or wrong. I don't need to nitpick about there being a false equivalency there, but and I don't think that. So he did say also there that he would agree with sanctions to punish Russia, and as punishment for Russia. And now sanctions are a collective, indiscriminate punishment, which collective punishment goes against international law. So if we if we have any respect for international law, then sanctions as a response to as retaliation to Russia, wouldn't be on the table in my opinion. But
yeah, I mean, I think it does depend a little bit on what kind of sanctions we're talking about. Although I also know that that Vaush has expressed support for some pretty broad, harsh sanctions on the entire country in the past. I certainly don't agree with that. But sorry, you were going to go.
Yeah, I just wanted to, he talks about China and, them stepping out of their sphere of influence. It's true, China has increased its investment in purchase of raw materials in East Africa, mainly to, power forward their own industrialization process. But it's not clear how you can, he seems to be looking at that and then drawing the inference that if the United States disengages, then China will simply take over that role of overthrowing governments and, extending their influence in the same fashion that the United States has all over Latin America, Africa, Eastern Europe. And I just don't see how you can draw that conclusion based on the available evidence of China's investments in East Africa or their purchasing of raw materials. I really don't see how that follows. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, I think that it is. Look, I don't think you have to be an apologist for the Chinese regime, which I don't think anybody should be. I think it's very authoritarian, and in many ways it's the epicenter of global capitalism right now. But I don't think you have to be one to see that the Belt and Road Initiative and some of the connections with the South American governments that Vaush is talking about in that statement are just not comparable to doing things like orchestrating coups or doing things like having spreading like hundreds of Chinese military bases all around the world. Like I think
funding terrorist groups,
Yeah.
funding people who engaged in torture and organ harvesting, that kind of. I mean, obviously, there's allegations of. Sorry.
Yeah.
But that was a reference to Yugoslavia in '99, where we armed the Kosovo Liberation Army, and that was another. So interestingly, the history of NATO in the recent past has been a history of doing coups and military interventions into countries and groups which are aligned with Russia, from Kosovo, Syria, Libya, even Afghanistan, and then the U.S. involvement in Syria and in Ukraine itself. And obviously, it's clear to see how Russia sees this as a brazen escalation after brazen escalation towards its partners. And so, not to justify anything that Russia's done, but to point out again that we've seen this coming, and it's been a long time coming, and we need negotiation more than ever.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. And I think that, again, okay, so all right, so there's a point I want to make about the arguments. There's a point I want to make about the vibe, for lack of a better word. So the point about the arguments is that I think one of the most important things that Danny said in that first, in that last bit, before Vaush started to speak again, is that if you agree with that premise, which I think Vaush sort of did at one point, right? Like it certainly sounded like he did. That the United States should not be playing this role in the world, not just that like individual actions are bad, like, that we did a coup somewhere and that's bad and we shouldn't do coups, right? Or that we're on the wrong side of a war somewhere, but like not just individual like policies, but that the role of the United States in the world is bad, that we should not be playing this kind of hegemonic, world straddling imperial policeman kind of. Yeah, exactly. That we shouldn't be doing this. And so one of the points that that Danny made there is that if so, right, if we shouldn't be doing this, then a realistic idea of how that would start to end would involve some painful decisions, right? Because if you're no longer going to be the world police, if you're no longer going to have hundreds of bases throughout the world, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Look, lots of actors in the world besides the American empire do bad things. And so there are going to be situations where locally, like bad things would happen, right? As a result of the United States drawing down. So either you think this should just be a permanent thing, or you're willing to think seriously about those trade-offs, which is not to say that it would have to be like, whatever, like a left-wing government comes to power in the United States and like 30 days later, there are like no American soldiers anywhere, and it's all done, right? I think you can say that there are local conflicts that have to have negotiated settlements, et cetera, but at some point you are going to have to make these painful decisions. And it seemed there was a moment just before Vaush finished when he sounded like he was conceding that, but then the whole thrust of everything he was saying was to say, no. Anytime that there's something that the U.S. could do that's good, right? We got to do it. And more than that, it seemed like his general posture, right? The main thing he was pushing was that if the United States wasn't the world's dominant, power, that like some other country would just step into its place. It's like, well, if you really believe that, then you don't actually, presumably, want to dismantle the global empire, or you want to wait until there's a successor that you think would be better, to do that, right? And certainly in the world as it exists right now, like if you really believe that if the United States wasn't the imperial global hegemon, then China would be the imperial global hegemon, which he said, and you don't believe that, and you believe that China would be worse, which I think he said, right? That certainly seemed to be the implication maybe being unfair there. Like, if you believe both of those things, then it sounds like you don't want the United States to stop being a global empire. I don't understand how you can like believe both of those things and also believe the things that he seemed to be saying he agreed with at the outset.
Yeah. And what was interesting is Danny makes his first statement. Vaush says, I agree with almost everything you said there. Danny makes his second statement. Vaush said, I disagree with almost everything you said there. So very interesting. And there was one line in particular I just want to draw attention to. His argument he gave is basically said, yes, the IMF is bad. Yes, neocolonialism is bad, but these are lifelines for these poor countries. And the alternative is destitution. And obviously both outcomes are bad, destitution versus IMF debt peonage. But Russia and China are inherently worse than us. So if we pull back, they will automatically fill this void. And at least the US is the devil we know, is more or less the argument that he's making there. And I couldn't disagree, more with that. But
yeah, this came up in the discussion I had with him as well, where he seems to view IR, or international relations, really as a zero-sum game. So he actually stated if it wasn't for NATO expanding, Russia would fill that vacuum. If NATO didn't exist, Russia's borders would stretch all the way up to Germany currently, and he absolutely believes that. It's really an ahistorical way of viewing autocrats, because he has this belief that all autocrats will intrinsically want to expand land and conquer territory, and he can't seem to really draw a distinction, between autocrats operating in a very specific context of late capitalism or neoliberal capitalism and feudal empires and the empires of antiquity. He just lumped them all together in this ahistorical fashion, and from that he draws this inference that if it wasn't for NATO expansion, you just have Russian expansion all across Western Europe, trying to put back together the Soviet empire as far as they could, which is just really, there's no evidence for that for a number of reasons we can get into later.
Yeah, I mean, that the idea that the ambition of every power would be to have this global role, I think if you just look at the history of things that different military powers have done, right? I mean, it's not actually everyone constantly trying to make some bid for this kind of world dominance, right? Because if nothing else, you often lack the capacity. You often rationally believe that trying to do that, right, would actually be worse, end up much worse for you. I think there are a lot of reasons why cynical, self-interested players might not actually be interested in trying to do that. But that was okay. So that was very weird, right? That's the argument point, right? It's well, do you actually want to dismantle American, global empire or not? Because it sounded like it at first, right, when he said, "Oh, I agree with almost everything you said." It sounded like he was saying yes. And then just now in the "I disagree with everything you just said," which is funny because I think the second round of things Danny said were a pretty obvious extension of the first round of it all seemed like a fairly straightforward if you believe the first set of things, you're probably going to believe the second set of things, right? And if anything, I mean, he's not he's not a ideologue about it. He's willing to say they're difficult trade-offs and whatever, right? But if you believe the first set of things, it's really hard to avoid saying the second set of things. And so I think there's a little bit of inconsistency about whether the United States should be playing this role. And then the other point is, the vibe point that it's just when he talks about all of Europe, having this interest in the, Russian expansionism. I mean, all I can flash to is if you've ever seen the movie Reds, the Warren Beatty and Diane Keaton. Have you guys seen this actually? Okay,
I haven't. Sorry.
All right. Go home and watch Reds. So John Reed is the American journalist who documented the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, and he's played by Warren Beatty in this movie. It's a classic movie from, I don't even know, 70s or 80s or something, maybe even earlier than that. I could be totally wrong about the decade actually, but it's an old movie, and there's a scene at the beginning where they're talking about World War I, and Diane Keaton tells Warren Beatty, "Oh, but don't you think this is really about stopping German militarism?" And he kind of makes fun of her for saying that, and just that whole thing just now about Russian expansionism. It's look, is Russia? Yeah, I think it is. Right? I think it acts like imperial powers act, and it's doing that in Ukraine right now. But just this super simple narrative that it's okay, Russia does bad and imperialist things. Everybody else is just trying to contain it. I get I don't know. I get very German socialists voting for voting the Kaiser war credits vibes from hearing that.
And just real quick, a point made. He's talking about. He made a point about Ukraine, newly discovered, I think, natural gas deposits off the ocean, and something that's not brought into this as well. I mean, sorry, just to make it quick, this could just be another war over oil. Ukraine has said, as respect to Nord Stream 2, that it's a threat to its national security. 80% of Russian oil goes through Ukrainian pipelines, and they're forced to give billions of dollars to the Ukrainian government, which is a lifeline for them. It's how they stay afloat. And the sanctions have had specific carve-outs for gas, oil and natural gas exports. So that's just something I wanted to mention briefly, because I think the economic side of it doesn't get brought up.
Fair enough. Let's keep watching.
The type of analysis, or really your assumptions about geopolitics, are very much shaped by the realist tradition of foreign policy, which really focused on material capabilities and assumes a particular form of human nature, what Hans Morgenthau, who was the guy who developed realism, called, I believe I'm getting this correct, forgive me if I'm wrong, an animus dominandi. Like, it's a human nature to just naturally expand to fill power vacuums. I would just say personally, and this is something that everyone needs to decide for themselves, I don't think human beings are like that necessarily, and I don't think international politics necessarily functions in that way. So I totally take your point about the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, being done in Africa, but I don't think that signals a Chinese search for world domination by any stretch of the imagination. I think that China, particularly the Communist Party, is primarily worried about its domestic political stability and the future of the party, given the rapid transformation in the Chinese political economy over the last 40 years, and has no real desire to, for example, construct a global basing structure, what people have termed the empire of bases that the United States has constructed, which, as you rightly point out, does not rest on annexation, even though I don't want to ignore the fact that we do have 5 colonies, but does not rest, the US doesn't want to, make Ukraine a state or make Ukraine a territory. I think that's absolutely correct. But it's still a different form of empire, the sort of imperial empire and the economic empire of dollar hegemony. But what I would argue is that when one is engaging in political and geopolitical analysis, one needs to focus less on just the pure capabilities and actually on political intentions. And this is, I'll plug my book. This is something I address a lot in my book titled Democracy in Exile, which is the disagreement between people in the 50s when they were trying to make nuclear strategy as to whether you just focus on capabilities or you focus on intentions and therefore politics. And there were disagreements. And I think the side that won is the side that focused on capabilities, because it's easier to quantify capabilities. It's easier to make arguments about capabilities to policymakers to get you to do what you want. But and from my perspective, the most sophisticated political analysis needs to examine history and needs to examine the intentions of actually existing leaders. So I would just disagree as a matter of principle with the idea that because people have capabilities, they will naturally expand. Now, in terms of your historical point about the Soviet, Stalin was just setting up the Soviet power block and waiting for the capitalist world to collapse, I think that's more true of the 40s and up until 1953 when Stalin died than it is of the later Soviet Union. I really do think between 1953 and 1955 was a moment when the Cold War could have ended if the United States had actually focused less on capabilities and more on intentions. So this is partially where my opinion comes from. I think if you were looking at, the people who were fighting to succeed Stalin, what they were arguing, there was a moment there, particularly at the Geneva Conference of, I believe, 1954, when there could have been real détente decades before actual détente happened. So I do think it's important not to only focus on capabilities. And then I think you really get to the heart of the matter in a very strong way about the idea of a right or wrong side. So this obviously begs a lot of questions. Who's determining what's right or wrong? But let's even leave that to the side. The question then I would pose to you.
I don't want to pause for more than 30 seconds, but I got to give Danny Bessner shit about misusing the phrase begging the question here. He means
we usually mean it as prompts the question.
Yeah, exactly. He's saying what he means is raises the question. Begging the question means you're assuming what you're trying to prove. What you're saying is raise the question. So, do better. Also, thank you so much for the super chat. I think so. The person says WTF, China's robbing Africa. If that's not imperialism, I don't know what is. So okay, so I think that arguments about the Belt and Road Initiative and the extent to which that's an attempt to sort of, again, not necessarily for any altruistic reason, but just for geopolitical reasons, to like build goodwill, and the extent to which there's an element of economic exploitation there is something different leftists argue about. But I will just, I think that, I think Daddy's really specific point about that was just that, like, there's a far cry between seeing an opening there to do something that would be in China's interests, however you read the details of that,
Yeah.
and making a bid to become
Control their countries.
Yeah,
Control
exactly.
their resources. Yeah. I turn into a raging capitalist on that point, and I say that more competition is good. If China wants to compete with the IMF and they're giving better loan requirements and not imposing restructuring packages that force the countries to open themselves up to foreign investment and effectively buying the country, then more power to them. So
yeah, I mean, even if it's like, again, even if you have like a super dim view of that, I mean, it's just not an attempt to take on anything like the role in Africa, right, that the United States has in much of the world. Like, maybe you think, if you have the dimmest possible view of it, that one day it'll become that or whatever. But like, I think as a description of present realities, it's just not that. And in fact, it seems like they're certainly not squeezing these places in anything like the way that the IMF will. And I think they're probably playing a much longer game than that, in terms of, like, why make a few bucks now when you could like maintain this relationship, and it would benefit you for a very long time. So, and in any case, I mean, I just think that to sort of jump from that to saying that it's an attempt to become a global empire on the level of the United States, even on the level of, whatever you want to call it, with, like, we could do the terminology all day, but like, even the attempt to become a global power on the level of the Soviet Union in the Cold War, like, I don't even think that's true. But anyway, I just stopped because Bessner misused begging the question. My apologies. Let's keep watching.
Is, when historically have we gotten it right, even when we were doing something with noble intentions? I would say the historical record is pretty clear, that even when we intervened for so-called humanitarian purposes, let's say in the Balkans in the late 1990s, or I would say this was a not insignificant reason why the U.S. invaded Iraq. It often went in a different way than we intended, just because, and this is almost a philosophical point, I don't believe that any one nation has the capability to really shape another a nation in a particular direction, even if one was to say, I know what's right and I know what's wrong. That'd be more of a philosophical point. And the thing I want to end on is, you refer to the people of the world. And this is sort of like something that's been going on since the late 19th century, this sort of reference to international public opinion. But I would say that that is not a real opinion that could really be gauged. There's no legitimate institution. There's no way through which the people of the world are able to sort of channel their opinion in that way, in a realistic way. So it's not something that can really be appealed to, even though if someone looks back on sort of the late 90s and early 2000s with the argument about so-called RUP, responsibility to protect, people would often try to make arguments about, like, who has sovereignty, where do they have sovereignty, and refer to public opinion. I just don't think those are sort of solid enough things to base geopolitical decisions on. Maybe in a different world they would be, in a more democratic world, in a world without American hegemony, but as it stands in 2022, it's not. So this is why I do think, when you take the whole historical accounts into consideration, it really does mitigate against interacting in the politics of other countries. And then I'll just end on this one, sorry. The final philosophical point is, I think the people of a region are more able to determine what they want than the people outside of the region. that for long-term political development, for long-term political stability, that is what should be done. And the nations of Europe are quite rich. They don't need to depend on the United States to continue to fund their defense as they have for decades at this point. And it's a European issue that should ultimately be left to the Europeans. I don't think NATO has a reason for existing any longer, frankly, and we should probably disband it.
I'm just going to interject very quickly for 1 second here and just say that while everything is unbelievably civil and this is a great conversation, it might be difficult between people one or in format for the two of you having this conversation. If we have like, here's 3 or 4 questions I want to pose to you, and here's like 3 or 4 answers, maybe try and focus or
we can go point by point. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll respond broadly, but after that, let's tackle it point by point. I agree. I'll try to respond quickly so we can segue into that. So first of all, you claim that my beliefs on geopolitics and the universality of global domination are rooted in a misconception in human nature, but I disagree. Historically, it seems like all empires expand to the limits of their potential expansion. Historical examples of empires who grow complacent and only tend to their borders are fairly minimal. When they have the military or economic power, they take what they can. There are obvious examples like what we saw with the entirety of Western colonialism, but it goes well beyond that. If you want to look towards the Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, Chinese cities, or sorry, Japanese city-states and vassalages fighting with each other, it seems like there's always the desire to take more because, as you said, China's doing Belt and Road in Africa largely for domestic stability, but that's why we do it, right? The empire doesn't conquer the world because they care about the world. The empire conquers the world because the resources of the world make the empire richer, because the good PR of suppressing foreign peoples, fuels the bloodlust of your citizenry, because it's good for getting reelected. It's not really about the world. It's always about you, the people you care about. Rome scarcely cared about people directly outside the peninsula. The Western Roman Empire had its territories, sure, but they knew who they cared about. I don't think we're living in any different a situation now. I feel like all empires expand to the limits of their power. And I guess I don't see any reason to believe why that wouldn't be the case. The Soviet Union did this as well. They invaded Afghanistan. They sent tanks into Hungary. They did everything they could to send diplomats to run their coups, to eventually the military incentivize other countries to fall in line with them. We're all bastards. It's just a matter of whose reign is the most effective and the most stable. We won that game, but I don't think we won it because we were uniquely bad or vicious. I think we won it because we were uniquely rich. That's not a tremendous celebration of our moral supremacy, but it does make me concerned about this, in my opinion, rather naive belief that if we simply retracted, we can trust other geopolitical powers to not take up the space that we left. The only other thing I'll say is that I agree with your final point, which is that we often get these things wrong and we should defer to the will of these countries in terms of their support. And in this case, Ukraine has unambiguously thrown its weight behind the West, wanting to be a part of NATO, requesting support in terms of like armaments and munitions, taking advantage of that which we gave them. If they want our support, I think it's fine. The only reason NATO still exists because Russia seems intent on maintaining a distinct military and economic bloc. I agree that NATO seems kind of vestigial in the modern world, but who cares about NATO in the day-to-day? It's not people who live in the UK. It's people who live in Estonia. It's people who actually live closer to Russia, because for them, NATO actually means something. It means they're not going to be the next ones to be Ukrained. Nobody in America or like France cares about NATO. They're safe. Nothing will happen to them. They have nuclear weapons. They're far from Russia. But, if the issue here is Russia and the countries next to Russia are afraid of them, then yeah, it seems like in this case we do have a right and a wrong side. The people who are to be victims of this conflict have chosen.
Yeah, I think I agree that if you're in the Baltic states, that NATO is important to you because you don't want to have Russian domination, which these states historically. If you look at their experience during, literally during World War II, they went back and forth between the Nazis and the Soviets, and it really wasn't a great situation. So I totally empathize with the sort of politics that people want. And I think it's important to sort of empathize with all of those things. I am speaking, though, from a bit, the perspective of an American. I'll just talk really quickly about, Vaush, what you were saying about the reasons for expansion. And I would say that what most IR scholars attribute expansion to, even realists today, if anyone studied poli-sci in college, it's sort of the neo-realist perspective that it's less human nature, which philosophically could kind of explain everything, and more the fact of what's called international anarchy, the fact that there's no overarching body around the globe to prevent expansion and that has a legitimacy that could do things like enforce international law. So I agree that there has been expansion oftentimes, but I wouldn't necessarily attribute it to human nature. And then one could argue that the goal is to get rid of that anarchy or create a democratic and legitimate global structure through which nations are able to appeal. And there's been a lot of problems with that in the past. And we could go into why the League of Nations or the UN failed to live up to what they were supposed to, but I'll leave it at that. But the final thing that I want to say is that I think these are serious issues, and we need to talk in terms of the time horizons that we're really referencing. And then just final, I would point people to the David Graeber and David Wengrow book. Have you guys talked about this on the podcast? Dawn of Everything, which is actually a very interesting new book that actually argues that there's a number of polities that actually did do things like not expand, that did decide not to pursue technological innovation, that did decide things that are in favor of political stability and more equality. Now, I'm not saying this is the final word. It seems like from experts there are problems with this book, but it does open a space for thinking about maybe this isn't inevitable. Maybe there's not some sort of will to domination that prevents the types of international cooperation that admittedly have been pretty elusive for the past few decades.
Yeah.
All right. I have a few scattered thoughts, but you guys want to start us off?
Yo, he shouted out the book I'm reading, Dawn of Everything. Fantastic book. And I think, honestly, it was a great rebuttal to Vaush bringing up random ancient history of this is what empires do. Well, when you're talking about the empires that are taught, yeah. But it's not, like Danny was saying, it's not a necessity. And really, we should be talking about like the broader time horizon and not the immediate moment. I think that's a very strong point that he made there. Obviously, troop build up, obviously the invasion happened and everything. But if you take a step back and look at the bigger scope of things, you're really able to get a handle and a grasp onto it in a more meaningful and powerful way. So.
Yeah, I just wanted to, talk about his statement about why NATO exists and expands, and that it's only here now in the post-Cold War period because of, to deter Russian aggression, or because it's invited in by these smaller countries. But in fact, if you look at the history of NATO expansion after the end of the Cold War, beginning, in the early 1990s, it was aggressively expanded largely by the Clinton administration and then by the Bush administration. Or the successive administrations after that, because for a large, to a large extent, it benefits defense contractors in arms exporting countries. When smaller nations sign up for NATO, they often have to commit to certain agreements to upgrade their military hardware, their military capacity. Now that's good for defense contractors in arms exporting countries, but for the smaller countries that end up as arms importers, they have to devote a larger and larger share of their national income towards this type of military expenditure, and it diverts resources away from other purposes, things like social welfare, infrastructural upgrades, economic development. In economics, it's referred to as the guns and butter dilemma or model, whereby the more you spend on one, the less you have for other domestic consumable items. And that's largely one of the rationales for NATO's continued existence and why it's been expanding. And he seems to take also the position that so long as Russia itself isn't threatened with invasion, that NATO's expansion doesn't in any way pose a type of threat to Russia's interest. But there's other reasons why it would want to oppose this. Number one, when you keep expanding like that, the probability of needless escalation or a provocation increases. It also increases the likelihood that NATO members around that region could engage in acts of provocation and not actually have to face any type of Russian retaliation. We saw this when Turkey shot down a Russian fighter jet, and essentially Russia was, helpless to react in any fashion because of the fact that it has NATO status. So, this isn't to say that Russian aggression is good, obviously, and it's not to say that Russia should be free to engage in violence. But from the a realist standpoint, you can understand why, even if there's no real threat of invasion, Russia would have issues with NATO's ongoing military expansion and encroaching right up to its borders. Something which he doesn't seem to take into account. He just seems to think that if there's not an invasion, Russia has no reason to fear it, and the only reason NATO exists is to deter Russian aggression, which I think is not borne out by historical facts or the current evidence.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I just wanted to add really quickly. He also mentioned about Ukraine's desire to be in the West and to be in the NATO and EU, and that they requested arms. And historically, Ukraine has been more or less ambivalent, and especially if you divide it along regional lines, the western portion of Ukraine overwhelmingly wants to be in Europe and in NATO and everything. When you get to the center, when you go to the south, and then when you go to the Far East, you start to have a situation where there are rising disagreement with that position. So to kind of lay it out black and white like that, Ukraine wants this, Ukraine wants to be in NATO, Ukraine wants to be, and especially if you look over the past 8 years, especially up until the recent few months, the Ukrainian position has been especially waffly on, less so EU status, but definitely more so NATO status for sure. Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, I think that's. I'm glad you said that. I think that's a really good point. I think that that the pro-Western bloc is bigger is certainly true, but it is a very divided country, and I mean, that there is a chunk of it, that's happy to be allied to Russia. There's a bigger chunk, that's pro-Western, but also, be pre-2014, governments go back and forth between those two positions, that were elected. So it's not as simple as that. Like, again, I know that admitting that there's any kind of complexity to anything that's happened in the last 8 years, that's not just a black and white morality tale makes you a Putin apologist, but there you go. And I also I'm so sorry. I keep on being afraid that I'm going to mispronounce your name.
Shaukat.
Shaukat?
Yeah, shock it, you can say.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Shaukat is. I think that your point is great about NATO expansion because, and again, I think it's really useful to just analytically separate the descriptive and moral claims here, right? Like we could sort out what's morally the correct take once we figured out just descriptively what happened, and I think people have a lot of trouble with that on this issue because if you say that NATO expansion plays any sort of role in even the sort of retrenchment of Russian nationalism or any of that, right? Then there's this sort of automatic move to say, oh, so you're saying the Ukrainians had it coming. It's like, no, motherfucker, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that as a matter of cause and effect, these things are related. And I think the idea that, oh, well, the only reason NATO continued to exist is because of as a defensive thing against Russia, because Russia wanted to continue to sort of hold together this power bloc. I don't think is right, because I think if you actually look at the timeline, that doesn't really make sense. That that Russia did not, in fact. I mean, there's the war in Chechnya, but I mean that's a separatist region within Russia itself. Russia did not, in fact, start to assert itself as a real power in the world again until Putin. But NATO expansion was happening under Clinton. When Yeltsin was president and Russia was a basket case. So
that is a very necessary point too. Clinton basically helped Yeltsin to get elected. They secured a massive IMF loan for his campaign. And he sent troops, thousands of advisors to help him, including offering strategy. And up until the very end, Yeltsin had made it out that if he wasn't going to win the election, he was ready to declare martial law and kind of send in the military basically to assert himself. And 4 years after Yeltsin gets elected, who gets handpicked by Yeltsin to replace him?
Yeah, Putin.
It's Putin. Mm-hmm. So in a roundabout way, I mean, it's this insanity because it's it's so strange to talk about because in a way Putin is the result of a U.S.-backed coup in Russia, or at least election interference, and then we've gone ahead and blamed Russia for their election interference, and then a coup in Ukraine, and now we have a U.S.-backed Ukrainian government fighting with the result of a U.S.-backed Russian government, and it's absolute insanity. And I think it gives all the more power to Danny's point that we need to draw down the military. We need to stop doing all of these, these actions and pretending to be the world police.
Yeah, I mean, look, Putin is a not unusual case of somebody who we thought was going to be our bastard who decided that he wanted to be his own bastard. So, what were you going to say, Shakat?
Yeah, I was also going to mention it was under the Clinton presidency that, NATO launched a war against Yugoslavia. And that's interesting because not only was it a war of aggression in violation of international law, it was in violation of NATO's own charter because there was no Article 5 breach here that would have justified that campaign. And I think, at the time, Russia was watching that. It sent a clear signal that, NATO would be, poised to use, an offensive operation outside of its own mandate, and that it couldn't just be viewed as a defensive alliance moving forward. And that doesn't mean it would attack Russia, but it could potentially threaten Russian allies if it kept expanding. And so it can't really be sold as a defensive alliance anymore. And what's interesting is that Putin, when he gave his speech justifying his attack on Ukraine, he really took a page out of NATO's playbook for the war on Yugoslavia, where they talked about genocide in Kosovo or humanitarian abuses against Albanians in Kosovo necessitating military action. And Putin justified this invasion by talking about the genocide in the Donbass region and, a group of ethnic Russians in this enclave who had been shelled and terrorized for 8 years, which is also interesting. So I really think you need to situate everything that, a lot of what Putin has done, based on, what transpired under the Clinton presidency and, that earlier war against Yugoslavia as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that look, obviously the war against, I mean, you're talking about 1999, not the earlier Bosnia intervention, right? So, I think the war against Serbia, I mean, it happens, it's being waged, against a despicable regime that was doing despicable things. But yeah, it also was like a violation of the NATO charter. It was extremely aggressive, bombing campaign. I mean, like really, like openly just targeting like TV stations and stuff as legitimate targets. And that was, and again, the fact that was against a Russian ally is pretty relevant here, right? That like, again, if you're just making claims about cause and effect, not justification, because sure, once we start talking about justification, I don't think any country has like a God-given right to, to control its sphere of influence or anything. But if we are just talking about cause and effect, it's just not true that there's some sort of Russian aggression that all the NATO stuff was in response to. I mean, like it was much more NATO assertiveness that Russian nationalists were responding to. And the last thing I just wanted to say, I know it's been a while since we played this part, but like this idea. So at the end, Daddy's referencing the dawn of everything to argue about the human nature issue, which is probably too interesting. We don't want to open that can of worms, but the claim that he was making that response, like Vaush saying that
empires always expand. Look at the Roman Empire type of thing.
Yeah, he's going like his examples are like his two examples were the Roman Empire and the Soviet Union. I just want to point out those are very different countries, right? That's and like with very, very, very different, trajectories. Like, whether you want to call the Soviet Union imperial power or not, I don't really want to fight about the terminology, but like what the Soviet, like the two examples he gives for the Soviet Union, which again is just not pursuing the same kind of agenda as the Roman Empire, to put it mildly, right? I mean, that's pretty like that is a hell of a couple of historical dots to connect, to go straight from the Roman Empire to the Soviet Union. And the two examples of Soviet interventions, he's talking about, I don't think either of them really support his point, right? He said that empires always expand like as far as they possibly can, right?
Yeah.
Whatever their capacity is, they go up to that capacity. And one of his examples is Afghanistan, which is, I guess, a slightly better one for the case that he's making, although it's also, I think that there are...
Jay said we rolled tanks into an Eastern European country, and the Soviet Union got involved in Afghanistan. And I feel like the involvement in Afghanistan was more to stabilize the existing pro-USSR government rather than to imperialize the country.
Yeah, I mean, it is true that there was like a Soviet-backed coup in Afghanistan at the same time that they were putting in, like, in other words, there was like the left-wing, like PDPA government that was allied with the Soviet Union. Like that already existed. That was not like something the Soviet Union imposed on them. That much is true, right? Then there was a civil war, but then the Soviet intervention also did involve, like, deposing the existing leaders of the PDPA and putting in more Soviet-friendly ones, and etc. It was like they were really acting in a lot of ways like an imperial power. But you're right, it was ultimately, like the U.S. and South Vietnam, right? It was all ultimately stabilizing an existing state rather than trying to expand. And certainly that's true about his other examples. Other examples, Hungary in 1956, right? And that just like, okay, sure, the Soviet Union has sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Nobody denies that, right? But like, that's not like, I think it's just historically not at all accurate to say that, what the Soviet Union had in Eastern Europe was like the first step in some sort of grand plan to become the imperial world hegemon. I mean, that was a buffer zone that it wanted. Don't get me wrong, it's not a very nice thing to do to these countries to make them that buffer zone, but it was a buffer zone that they wanted because they'd just gone through World War II and they didn't want anybody to be in a position to encircle and invade them again.
Yeah, and that intervention is actually the origin and basis for the insult tanky. And so, not to be labeled as a tanky myself, I would like to point out that there could be a case to be made that that region wanted to break away from the Soviet Union, and so them sending tanks in to kind of guarantee and lock them in as a satellite state, or whatever you'd like to call it.
Right.
That is an argument to be made, but there's different positions to be had on it. It's not as if it's set doctrine or anything.
Yeah, and I just want to point out, I tried bringing this up when I spoke to him, but his statement that all empires, want to expand is at such a level of abstraction almost that it's just a meaningless type of statement. I mean, under feudalism and, antiquity of the Roman Empire, the coercive nature of that labor process was such that, the producing classes would often run up against barriers in terms of their own reproduction because so much of the subsistence was being, extracted from them through military force and violence that they couldn't reproduce fast enough, which is why you'd have all sorts of famines and starvation under feudalism. So it almost necessitated constant outward expansion for them to find new land, new peasantry, new producing classes. But that type, and this has been, covered by a number of Marxist scholars who have, discussed the difference between those type of, feudal and slave modes of production versus, capitalism, even modern capitalism. But there's nothing under, Russian capitalism currently that would seem to necessitate or require as an internal dynamic that type of outward expansion. So, I mean, to compare it to the feudal empire and to, antiquity, the Roman Empire, etc., it's just, it's not a good comparison, and you can't draw the inference that because these former empires expanded when they had very different internal modes of production that you could expect Putin or Russia or any other current empire to want to do the same in terms of land acquisition. So there's that as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I think that just this idea that all empires are going to expand up until they can no longer militarily muster it. I mean, I think look, it almost doesn't even matter what you think the historical mechanism is, right? If you think it's culture, cultures are different. If you think that there's materialist explanation, well, the economic incentives are different, right? That there are like the internal dynamics of those societies that that fuel imperial projects just are not the same from like the Roman Empire to the Soviet Union to the sort of post-Soviet, oligarchic kleptocracy that exists there now. I mean, these are just radically different kinds of societies that have different reasons for wanting to pursue some foreign policy.
Well, that's true, and that's why I bring it up, because he claims to be a big adherent of Marxist thought or Marxist economics, and yet his statement about empires is devoid of any kind of specificity or historical specificity, and it's not anchored within any historical materialist context that could really allow us to evaluate why the qualitative differences in these different empires and why they acted in a certain way, and why it's not reasonable to draw inferences about current modern day nation states. So yeah, that's something I think should be pointed out.
All right, let's go back to the debate.
Certainly there are different complexities here. Some empires, I think, are going to be, for example, I don't think Switzerland is constantly mulling over with their Secretary of Defense or whatever their equivalent is about the potential invading Germany to get some more Lebensraum. Obviously, there are constraints here. I think that China has well demonstrated its intentions. China, obviously, I think its behavior indicates that it has every intention of being the next world superpower. I don't know if it's going to be able to be that, because it's going to face a pretty significant population crash soon, with the number of elderly people to be taken care of. And additionally, you can only go so far when a good amount of your domestic labor is like sweatshop producing, cheap plastic toys for Americans. There are thresholds there. They might be able to. I think when I think of peace in the near future, Russia concerns me so specifically because I feel like they aren't component to a lot of the peace incentivizing factors that exist for other countries that we might otherwise have conflict with. America will never go to war with China. It would be ridiculous, of course, because even if we were to somehow win instantly, even if we could somehow snap our fingers and annihilate them with no chance of reprisal, we would devastate our own economy in the process. There would be it's an unwinnable economic conflict. We tend to center our conflicts now in countries with economies that are so war-torn that honestly bombing them only gives them more money because they can resell the scrap from the bombs. Like that's how, like, we're talking about how dirt poor countries like Afghanistan are. We're not blowing up like billions of dollars of infrastructure when we engage in our let's say charitably hijinks there. And for that reason, economic development and geopolitical trade or global trade, these are the metrics that seem to incentivize peace. And Russia doesn't seem to want to play ball with that. They had the chance after the fall of the Soviet Union to just be another European country. I'm not saying that that's not implicitly a way of submitting yourself to Western hegemony, because it totally is. But the alternative now is that rather than one hegemonic power in Europe where things are relatively stable, we have one hegemonic power and one power with the nukes of a hegemonic power that's pretending to be hegemonic, riling up conflict. It's essentially, and they're no better. In many respects, they're worse. The agitation, the conflict, it's brought about by a lack of synchronicity in the region, which is one of the reasons why I'm so hard on Russia here. They can't offer a better world for the countries in their orbit. They're not wealthy enough to do what we do, which is provide a real umbrella of prosperity to countries that we have strong ties to, Western Europe, whatever. So it seems like as long as Russia is the way that it is, it and the countries near it are doomed to destitution and military antagonism towards adjacent NATO countries. And that scares me a lot. I don't know how to fix that without some kind of soft power. People didn't like my take on sanctions, and that's because historically sanctions are shit. I acknowledge that. But I'm at a loss, right? Like, do we simply let Russia take what they want? Do we maintain a hard line? We can pick apart NATO, sure, but what about the countries, Estonia, what have you? They don't have nukes. Do they just get to be absorbed? I don't know what the solution is.
Well, I think your last question just points to the fact that there is no good solution. So when I'm thinking as a moral person on the left, I don't want any country to be dominated by any other country, right? That's the ultimate leftist position, which is in some way a liberal position because it's really emphasizing the importance of sovereignty as opposed to other values. But let's just put that aside. I am an American. I like civil liberties and things like that, and I don't like oppression and people conquering other nations. So as a moral person, as a moral actor in the world. That's what I think. But again, as a historian and someone who, might have a voice in American foreign policy, I have to take sort of the whole picture into consideration. And then I, again, just would point people to look at the actual history. Look at Paul Chamberlain's book, Rethinking the Long Peace, which is a history of the Cold War, and just shows how violent the Cold War really was, and what horrible consequences U.S. foreign policy actually had on the world. Now, in terms of Russia, I think we are in an interesting situation, because Russia is, on paper, a pretty weak country. It has a GDP, I think, actually less than Italy, or equivalent to Italy, whatever that's the famous statistic is, but it does have nuclear weapons. So that does give it sort of a more of a say in international politics. But again, I would have to say, looking on balance, I don't think the U.S. should necessarily decide what happens in Eastern Europe, even if there are outcomes that, as a moral person, I would not prefer. Now, the question of world domination is really important, because let's put to the side the intentions of the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping, which, again, I want to reiterate, I don't think have suggested that there is a Chinese will to world domination. I don't think that's accurate, but I'm not a China specialist. I don't speak Mandarin, so I'm relying on.
Can I ask something really quick? Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. I just want to clarify.
No, it's okay.
When you say world domination, I want to know what you mean there, because I don't think when I think of American world domination, I think of a world where there is no border an American corporation cannot cross, and no worker that cannot be underpaid. When I think of Chinese domination, I think of the same thing, and not like literally like the Nazi arrows over the map.
No, totally. So I mean, to me, the sine qua non is the military bases. This is something that we don't often, think about, but there are 750 military bases placed strategically around the globe. And even if they're not like used every day, they are, in my opinion, a constant threat to the entire world. And I would point people to the work, I want to get his name right, David Vine of the Quincy Institute, who just improving U.S. global security through military bases, that I think is really interesting. And he wrote a report, 9 ways that drawing down overseas bases will improve U.S. security. So I'm talking about the military bases. I'm talking about, the imposition, not the imposition, but like a Chinese currency replacing the dollar. So I define American empire as dollar hegemony and the military base structure. That's what it ultimately rests on. So I don't think China is interested in that. China might be interested in sorts of free exchange of goods. I have no doubt that is on some level somewhat true, but I'm just referring to the structure of the American empire. And then I'll just end on this. I just don't think that's possible anymore, because I want to just read a very quick thing from the moment that the U.S. became hegemonic in 1945, or not even read, I'll just say. So what did that mean? In 1945, when the U.S. became the global hegemon, it had more manufacturing output than the entire rest of the world put together. It didn't require any post-war reconstruction. It totally dominated the Western Hemisphere. It had domination in every sphere of the military, Army, Navy, Air Force, intelligence. It was, and so take the Soviet Union. It was much more powerful than the Red Fleet and the Red Air Force. It didn't have the numbers of the Red Army, but it did have the nukes. It had supplanted the British as the sort of hegemon in East Asia. It was the entire creditor of the international economic system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I would also say, again, bracketing what China actually wants to do in the world, I don't think it's structurally possible for them to dominate the world like the United States did, and because it was kind of grandfathered in, currently does.
Yeah, so I acknowledge that it's bad that we have so many military bases abroad, but I feel like, if anything, those military bases are a vestigial element of the more sinister way in which we affect global conquest these days, which was, as you said, the hegemony of the dollar. We keep our US bases there, usually not as staging points for invasion, which, if we did, of course, we would be in like 50,000 wars right now, as opposed to however many pseudo wars we're currently a part of, but rather so that these countries are marked as our territory. They're our bitches, essentially. We brand them with our military bases, but you can do that without the military base, right? The military base itself is more of a symbolic expression of hegemonic power. The real issue is the economic investment. It's like the difference between controlling a neighborhood by posting a bodyguard in everyone's house as opposed to controlling a neighborhood by getting them all hooked on drugs and they have to come to you to get their next fix. It feels like it's a much more efficient way of essentially meting out the same degree of control with way less overhead. If anything, one of the reasons I want America to take down its military bases is so that we have more money to spend on effectively opposing the geopolitical interests of other countries that would do as bad as, if not worse than us, because we seem to bleed quite a lot of money through this vestigial expression of our global power. The Belt and Road Initiative, I think, will achieve ultimately the same goal. And if we're to look at who's being harmed here, the U.S. military bases don't generally harm people. I think people just like jerk off on the base all day, like they sit there. They're like an expression of our power, you know. But yeah, but the poverty we bring to these countries, the poverty we incentivize and maintain through, you know, one-sided trade deals, those kill millions of people every year. The economic dependency is the real harm, and I don't see any metric by which China is intending to do less of this than we are. You know.
Yeah, so I think that's interesting, and I totally agree on the economic damage done by the American empire, and that it's a super important part of the equation. But I do think we on the left tend to sort of de-emphasize just the importance of those bases because they haven't necessarily been used in a major war. So just to take an example, just to take some quick statistics, between 2018 and 2020, the U.S. undertook 85 in at least 85 countries counterterrorism operations, oftentimes linked to bases that are staging grounds, areas for recruitment, areas for exchange, and things like that. So there is a lot of damage done. And I think if you look at the historical research, the aforementioned Lindsay O'Rourke and the covert regime change, even those sorts of minor special forces interactions actually do have very negative consequences. You know, they do result in more authoritarianism, more violence in particular, even if it's unsuccessful. So I do think it's really important. I appreciate what you're saying about like getting everyone hooked versus putting a bodyguard in everyone's house, but those bodyguards in everyone's house are always reminders that that bodyguard could beat you up. You know, that's not completely meaningless. So I don't want to lose sight of that. And I think if one is thinking a bit theoretically, one of the interesting moves that can be done in the next few years is for an analyst to unite the economic and security elements of American hegemony. If I recall correctly, if you remember Leo Panich's and Sam Ginden's book, The Making of Global Capitalism, relatively early on, they're like, we're going to talk about the economy and we're not going to talk about the security elements. But I think these things go together and you can't really just bracket one from the other.
I agree with that. They are definitely intertwined, which is, of course, the reason why China recently built a military base in Africa near Djibouti, in a strategic zone that would allow them to better oversee their economic interests in the region.
Wow, one whole base.
Obviously, they aren't quite competing with our plurality of bases. I'm not saying they're not something worth deconstructing. I only fear the consequences of our disinvolvement. You know, we see a parallel of the Ukraine situation in Taiwan right now, for example, where we've supplied them armaments, defensively in case they're attacked by China. Critics of this action say that defensive armaments could easily turn to offensive armaments. To which the correct response is, of course, Taiwan isn't going to invade China, you lunatic. That's not going to happen. There's no context in which that would ever happen. They're not going to kamikaze the mainland. But people talk about like, well, you disinvolve yourselves. I think that, and this is genuinely tragic, and I come across, of course, as something of a chauvinist by saying this, but a lot of countries understand that in the war for geopolitical control, they only get to choose their master. Taiwan will never be an autonomous master of its own fate. The Baltic region will never, at least not for a very long time, be an autonomous master of their own fate. The only thing that gets you even close to that is nuclear armaments. And even then, trade deals are still an effective way of supplanting the will of other nations. It's about who you choose to rule over you. And the West just offers a better package deal, at least in the Baltic region, than Russia ever could. We're just wealthier, And this isn't so much a supporting U.S. hegemony type issue as it is an acknowledgement that when there's only hegemony to be found, you go with the one that hurts people the least. China is a bit more contentious because, as I understand it, their investments in the Belt and Road Initiative, while similar to what we've done in a neocolonial sense in many ways, sometimes seem to be a little bit better. I understand they're indebting these countries and heavily, infiltrating their economic infrastructure with Chinese businesses, Chinese contracts, Chinese officials. So, and they're going to be indebted, and they're in the pocket for a long run down the line. Uh, Possibly they're doing this in a slightly more humanitarian way than we are, in which case I guess my utilitarian approach here would have to be flipped, and I'd have to say that we should supplant them with Chinese hegemony because that's less harmful. So the only reason I bring this up, I feel like we agree on the broad strokes, but when these pivotal issues come up, like with Ukraine, we know at least with Ukraine, they don't have the choice of no hegemon. That's just not an option for them, not with them being at the border of Russia. Um, in those instances, I feel like an unwillingness to involve ourselves in ways aligned with the desires of the Ukrainian people often has the consequence of suggesting by implication that the hegemonic rule of other powers is preferable to our own, or that it's neutral, or there's no difference, that it's just kind of a, well, whose hands are bloody type situation. But we don't want to invade Ukraine, of course. We're giving them money and weapons, which is a far sight better than what Russia wants to do with them. And I get called, a chauvinist for saying this, but I feel like this is consistent with an anti-imperialist perspective broadly, considering it's what the people of that nation seem to want.
Yeah, the way I would describe it, it's consistent with a liberal internationalism, which is the sense that the United States has the capability to manufacture the world in a particular way, and that's been the dominant or a dominant approach to American international affairs for a long time. So
we're only doing what they want, right?
Right, and then who's they? Right, and then
the Ukrainian people.
So just one second. So I think that we then have to ask, like, offers a better package deal to whom? Because again, I'm not expert on the Ukraine situation, but I imagine that there's different groups in Ukraine that want different things depending on geography, depending on perceived cultural ties, etc. But that's almost neither here nor there, because then we get into questions of sovereignty and who are we talking to, and why do they get to represent the will of the people and other people don't get to represent the will of the people, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to just stay out of that for a second, because again, I think the question is, are we even able to do this in a good way? And to that, history is the only guide, and history is pretty clear that we're not able to. But if you want, we could get into questions about, like, who is sovereign in a particular moment? Why are they sovereign? Why are they the ones that we should be listening to? Which is ultimately what happens when you zero in on any of these situations, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's the Balkans, whether it's Iraq, whether it's Afghanistan. Who speaks for whom is ultimately the question.
Yeah, of course. Oh, sorry.
And I would suggest that in the past we've gotten that wrong more than we've gotten that right. But again, that's a little bit neither here nor there. This is why I think this being clear about the time horizon and the trade-offs that one has to make is really crucial. Because if we're thinking that we do want to get rid of the empire, like you said, get rid of the bases, the budget, spend more on home, whatever you want to do it for, that you do have to at one point make the decision not to intervene, make the choice that the United States doesn't have to have an opinion on what happens everywhere in the world at all moments, while fully admitting to yourself that that will have negative consequences in the short term. And I would say, to do it responsibly, you don't just leave tomorrow. You do things like, let's say in East Asia, have some sort of decade-long security transition where you allow U.S. partners or U.S. allies to begin to build the independent capabilities that would allow them to, in some sort of meaningfully democratic way, make their own way in the world, while admitting that the United States isn't going to be there. Because what I would say is that the United States isn't going to be there. What I fear what will actually happen is that there'll be some drastic move taken by China or Russia the United States has not actually prepared for, but the United States is not going to fight World War III over Ukraine or Taiwan. And so there'll be some slapdash retreat from the region that actually leads people worse off. Because I don't think the United States is going to fight wars over these regions, regardless of whether I think they should or not. And that is also an important political reality that should undergird what we think should be done in these areas.
Yeah, all right. I agree with some of the stuff you're saying, but I feel like some of the language here trends close to apologism for me. So the American imperialism has found many forms in the past, but I feel that what's happening in Ukraine right now is categorically distinct, where you have a supermajority of the population who want to be a part of NATO, which is a pretty severe step, but broadly prefer American or Western intervention in supplying them armaments to what Russia's doing. I understand that taking a step away from being the world police is a viable long-term step, but this isn't some issue in a vacuum. If Russia takes Ukraine, after all, not only does that cause immense immediate suffering, but they now push their border closer to NATO. If they take all of Ukraine, not just the east of Ukraine, then we come against the same problem over again. And you start having, Russian posturing against the next country that isn't in NATO if we pull back, or if we don't, we then have the Cold War border set up again, except we've drawn the Iron Curtain a little bit farther to the east, which seems to me like a disfavorable geopolitical situation and one that could lead potentially to a lot of harm. I wonder here, because you said that you wanted to defer to the interests of the people there, but the interests of the people in Ukraine are clear. And then you say, well, whose interests? Who's made that decision? I'm not suggesting Ukraine is a perfect democracy. They don't. And I don't think you're ever going to get 100% of any population to agree on anything. But I think it's a pretty well established the people of Ukraine do not want Russia to invade, and they do want help to prevent that from happening. If we're not to respond to that, not just us as the United States, but NATO and the rest of Europe in alignment with their interest to keep Russia from creeping ever westward, is this not a legitimate act of our power? We're doing what they ask. They request help, and we provide it for them. And all of this is being done in spite of the fact that over the past 10 years, Russia has been funding secessionist groups and political contrarianism in the eastern section of Ukraine. I mean, there's been a whole lot of fighting over there because Russia is like explicitly trying to manufacture a political crisis they can take advantage of, which it seems like it hasn't worked yet. Because it hasn't reached the capital. It hasn't done enough to weaken the country to the point that America wants to keep their hands off, that NATO wants to keep their hands off. They're going to keep doing this, even with NATO countries. It's not a violation explicitly of NATO boundaries for Russia to slip money to secessionist groups in Estonia or what have you. And, they get their rustling. And then 20 years down the line, after being bombarded with Russian friendly media that, sensationalizes domestic issues, makes things seem worse. What they did with us, but well, worse, they could creep ever onwards again. This isn't just about Ukraine. It's about Russia here. And it's not just about being a world police officer. It's about world peace. It seems like supplying armaments is a good immediate stopgap. If nothing else, a Russian invasion of Ukraine should be mutually bloody rather than bloody only for the Ukrainians.
Yeah, well, I guess I don't think Putin's going to invade also. So that's just like my reading of this. So let me just state that outright. I may very well be wrong. It's happened in the past. And let's also bracket that, the US does a lot of stuff like what you were saying Russia does, and everyone knows that. We all know that at this point. I think in some sense we're talking in different registers. When I said that we should listen to the people, that was more a philosophical claim about like people in broad regions are better able to determine like how their region should situate itself. I think on the whole, I would say history kind of demonstrates that. And you're making more the philosophical point about legitimacy, and then I would say, whose legitimacy? Is there really an international community that is genuinely democratic, or are these
appreciate that very much,
in
Isaiah.
various countries? Blah 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 blah. So I just wanted to note that.
What do you mean by that, though?
In terms of what?
So,
like the UN, there's no legitimate body of international law. U.S. doesn't join the ICC. The U.S. doesn't follow its own international laws. The United Nations is not a democratically legitimate institution. Not the entire world has a say in what NATO does. It's oftentimes military elites. These aren't democratic institutions. So then the question becomes, who's deciding what? Is this legitimate or not? And those are all legitimate questions, but that sort of takes us into the nuts and bolts, and I don't think we're not
talking about UN interventionism, right? NATO is pretty straightforward with what they want, right? NATO wants expansionism, military, defensive pacts. It's not much of a neutral arbiter there. NATO has its clear on-the-shoulder biases. And when it comes to Ukraine, it's not a perfect government, but in this case, it seems like there's a pretty clear synchronicity between what they want: protection from Russia. Now, making Ukraine part of NATO would be inflammatory. Maybe not the best move, but supplying them arms, if nothing else, it's a deterrent. If you think that Russia won't invade, I think that's brilliant. I hope they don't invade. It'd make them look terrible after all that posturing. And now Ukraine is very securely in the bloc of the West, showing that after, since 2014, the Crimea situation, all their fussing about in East Ukraine hasn't managed to budge the country away from its biases towards Western hegemony.
Yeah, I mean, I read Putin as a pretty rational actor who has a particular reading of Russian history that essentially wants a security border, which is the long-term, 250 years old dream of Russian leaders. So I don't think he's like that difficult to read. And I think like if you look at the intervention in Georgia, if you look at Crimea, if you look at what's going on now, he's pretty clear he doesn't want the Western expansion east. And I think that's
I think he hoped we'd back off of Ukraine. I think he hoped that we wouldn't supply them arms, that, after pulling out of Afghanistan, the American people would be so sick of the idea of interventionism that it would be supremely unpopular. But because Biden's approval rating plummeted after Afghanistan, right? Logically, it seems like this would be a great time to take advantage of a lack of taste for interventionism. But thankfully, Comrade Biden stepped up to the plate with arms deals. Lockheed Martin, the vanguard of the proletariat. So maybe he overstepped a little bit. Maybe this was a miscalculation on his part.
I think he did. And if you look at the demands that he gave, they were wild. They were just you couldn't say yes to those. So I do think he and then we get into like, I think Putin's coming to the end of his political career. I think he's worried about the group of oligarchs that he heads. I think he's concerned because Putin has actually been, dovish isn't the right word, but he's been less interventionist than a lot of those under him. So I think he finds himself between a bit of a rock and a hard place. And I'm not excusing Putin. I don't, again, in a moral world, this is not the thing that I would do, but I'm trying to think through strategic empathy and putting myself in that particular position from that particular viewpoint, given his own particular history, even if as a moral person, I don't agree with any of it. So that's my read of Putin, may be wrong. I also just want to highlight again, the point that you made about like, if Putin gets Ukraine, then he's just going to keep on going west and west and west, which is the Munich analogy, right? We failed to stop Hitler in the Sudetenland, therefore we need to stand tough at all moments. I don't think for a variety of reasons that analogy holds. There's been a lot of, writing on the misuse of that analogy. But again, I would encourage people to distinguish between capabilities, which are easily measurable, and that's why people like making arguments based on them, and intentions, which are much more difficult to suss out, but in my opinion, more important, that involve the analysis of history, culture, society, and individual personality and psychology.
But if he didn't want to do that, why has Russian intelligence been so adamant in destabilizing former Soviet satellite states? Not just trying to form economic codependence, which has been difficult because Russia's poor and we're not, but also, like time after time, it's, propagandistic, this fell through, this plan was unmasked, it seems like, and this is, I think, borderline explicit, they want to rebuild the lines that were held during, the Warsaw Pact. They want to reestablish that boundary. I guess I don't really see a future in which Europe is safe without Russia being kowtowed to Western hegemony, because the alternative is them being kowtowed to Russian hegemony, which it seems like the same but poorer, and they do invasions sloppier than we do, because they don't have the money to back their threats up the way that we can. Like they could just be European country, I don't. It's difficult to talk about this in this respect. I feel a lot of leftists tie Russia to like, the legacy of communism or whatever, but Russia in its current form and in its Soviet form are to me as close to Russia as to communism as like the McDonald's Corporation. I have the ideological tie here. There's different power blocks, and the existence of two in this region is causing a lot of problems. I don't know if sanctioning would do anything helpful. Maybe sanctioning their leaders, freezing assets for wealthy oligarchs in our country, but something has to be done to turn them away from this expansionist tendency, their unwillingness to just live as a neighbor.
So I just want to address myself to that last point because I think it's important. So my read, it depends, I think, how you read the 1990s. And I think the shock therapy of Western capitalism, and this is like not a particularly leftist claim. The leftists do claim this, but this is like what George Soros argues. But I think that the brutality of neoliberal capitalization in the 1990s, basically, and the kleptocracy that it eventually led to, essentially made many Russian elites very skeptical of, quote unquote, just becoming another Western nation. And I think if you look back on the long history of Russia, going back to Peter the Great, you see the pendulum swing between, is Russia, quote unquote, Europe, or is Russia, quote unquote, Asian? And this is something that goes back and forth throughout Russian history with different people answering differently at different times. I would say Russia, there's no way, and I don't think anyone in Russia thinks that they're going to be able to reestablish the borders of the Warsaw Pact, barring threatening nuclear weapons. And I do think then the nuclear powers of Western Europe would respond to that pretty strongly. So I don't think that's really possible right now. So I guess that's not really a fear that I have. I think what would be the ideal position is for the United States to actually have genuine outreach with its European partners to Russia and not make clear as they did, I think, as the Cold War wound down, that it wasn't expanding, it won't expand NATO further eastward. I mean, that seems to be the claim. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but it seems to me pretty undeniable that as the Soviet Union was collapsing, Western leaders made clear that NATO wouldn't expand eastward, and they just went back on that. So it's not like crazy or totally unreasonable for someone like Putin to be a little nervous given Russian history about Western expansion eastward. Again, just trying to have strategic empathy and view what he might be thinking. So I guess I don't see these catastrophic circumstances as being in the realm of reality, sort of like these the engendering of a new European war or a new Berlin Wall or a World War III. That doesn't seem to me to be really on the table, given the realities of Russian power and the realities of Russian intentions as I understand them.
We never promised we wouldn't move eastward, I don't think. We had an on the table agreement to avoid NATO expansion during a time period when the Soviet Union or its remnants were pulling out of East Germany. But outside of that, it was a sort of one of the points which was brought up to Gorbachev, which was never formalized. I mean, obviously, with regards to the
Hey, thanks for pausing. Yeah, I think this was a big faceplant by Vaush, saying that we never promised that NATO wouldn't expand eastward. And I think it was Der Spiegel, the German magazine it came out, documents have unearthed recently of promises made to that effect, not only from H.W. Bush, but onward and from several different ambassadors. Also, the other huge thing that I wanted to stop and point out was Vaush said military bases are vestigial and that they're more like branding. You're our bitch now. After the NATO bombing of Kosovo, they built the largest military base in all of Eastern Europe there. And he said that military bases don't harm people. But, for example, in Okinawa, there's been a constant stream of rape and murder of U.S. soldiers, of local inhabitants. Every year, every couple of months, there's a new story. And the locals really hate it. There was a politician that was elected on the platform of removing the base, and Obama got that nixed real quick. But yeah, there's so much to comment on there. So I'll let someone else go, and maybe I'll chime back in.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, when he was talking about Ukraine, he was also talking about Russian funding for, insurgents and secessionist groups and this game or card that Russia plays. But it has to be kept in mind, the United States, through the National Endowment of Democracy, through the State Department, a number of other organizations, gave billions to Ukraine as well, leading up to the 2014 coup. And since that period also. And I mean, The Nation ran an article in, I think, 2014 or 15, talking about the Kiev government's, the new government's atrocities in eastern Ukraine, the use of artillery and indiscriminate shelling against, the ethnic Russians and others in the Donbass region, who wanted some form of secession. And so that clearly also fed into Russian moves in that particular region. It's not as if there was no autonomous type of sentiment to want to separate from the rest of Ukraine, or to want to join the Eurasian Economic Zone. Something else he talks about, because he mentions that the majority of the Ukrainian population, even with the Maidan protests, the support for that was split along regional lines. It wasn't a clear majority of Ukrainians who supported that, or who supported the entry into the European Union, or its economic association, or membership within NATO. So there were legitimate grievances in eastern Ukraine. It's not just Russia that was providing funding and conducting clandestine operations in that particular region. And so, that has to be taken into account as well. It's not like there's some hegemonic type of Ukrainian opinion about, what should transpire in terms of the European Union, at least not at that time when both of them were involved.
Good. Yeah. So I think that the point about bases is an important one. And I will just say, for anybody who's curious about my take on this, that last year I wrote an article for Jacobin. It's called U.S. Out of Afghanistan, U.S. Bases Out of Everywhere. And the point of the article is there were all these pundits. Well, I'll just read the description. It says, some hawkish pundits are asking why must America leave Afghanistan when it has permanent military presence in over 700 military bases around the world. They're accidentally suggesting a good point. America should leave Afghanistan. Those 700 bases should go too. So people are saying a lot of things like, oh, well, if it's a forever war, if we keep some troops in Afghanistan, then if we've been in a forever war in Germany and Japan and South Korea, it's like, okay, some of these things are more like active warlike than others, right? Obviously not in some cases, but it is an imperial presence. And I think that Vaush's metaphor, I think, is importantly wrong, or at least incomplete, right? It's not actually just that that the like controlling people by like being their drug dealers. They have to come to us for their next hit, not controlling them with bodyguards in their houses. I think that in this case, this would be more like so you're selling drugs, but you also, like any real world drug dealer, are prepared to violently repel anybody else who tries to do so on your corner. And it's and in fact, if you really want to extend the metaphor maybe to the point of absurdity, if you look at some of the ways the IMF acts, if you look at the history, including very recently, of U.S.-backed coups in Latin America, in some ways it's also like, if you try to go to rehab, we're going to kidnap you and bring you back, so to make sure that you're still using the drugs. But I guess the most important point I did just want to make about this is the claim that this vast network of 700 bases around the world, that it's, what do you keep calling it?
He said it's vestigial.
Yeah, vestigial. Yeah, vestigial. Like, I don't think that's at all accurate. I think that you're right. Like, yes, of course he's right. They're not all staging grounds for wars, in the sense that everywhere where there's a U.S. base, there's like about to be a war, or there's currently a war. But I don't think that has to be true. I don't think the options are that, or it's purely vestigial, right? That they have I think that they actually do play. I think there's like a constant implied threat, right? About how easy it would be. And two, I think that they play a real logistical role in America's wars around the world. Germany was diplomatically opposed to the invasion of Iraq, but American bases in Germany were hugely logistically important for the invasion of Iraq, bringing supplies back, back and forth, and American soldiers, back to hospitals and all of that stuff. And I think that the fact that having 700 bases around the world makes, even aside from the stuff that Shakan has pointed out about about Okinawa and the very good reasons that people resent the base there. Very good reasons why many South Koreans have resented the bases, even though there's like much more of a real local threat than there are in a lot of other places. Even putting all that aside, just the fact that we have all of these military bases around the world means that it would be really, really easy for us to launch wars all around the world anytime we wanted to, which of course that fact, and it's not just symbolic, it's not just vestigial, that fact shapes the way that America relates to the entire rest of the world. I mean, that's why we have this role in the world where if there's a crisis in Ukraine, right, the United States is a major player in that, right? If there's a crisis anywhere, the United States is a major player, because we maintain this capacity to relatively easily move troops around everywhere, right? And I think that does make the world a much more dangerous place.
Yeah, absolutely. One other point he said is that Russia needs to be kowtowed to Western hegemony, and this is kind of like the meme of liberals when they're being like anti-imperialist in theory versus liberals when the elites tell them that there's a good reason this time, and just the kind of like bloodthirstiness that's coming out there. And on the point of military bases, he brought up that China has a military base in Djibouti. That's literally their only military base. And he's using that to bring up about, look how scary China can be. Not only is that their only base, it's, smack dab parallel to a French base and a US base in the same area. And so, I mean, obviously.
I wasn't quite sure what point he was trying to make, but it really seemed like he was bringing that up to show that China had similar ambitions to the United States, or would like step into that role. And then I think right after he made it, he was even sort of awkwardly was like, okay, what? Because really, like one military base versus 700 military bases, I don't think that, look, I don't even think, like you mentioned, French bases, right? Like France has a way bigger military role in the world than China, but I don't even think France has any thought of stepping into the kind of role that the United States plays, and that's France. I mean, China definitely doesn't. It's not like as evidence that China is would be geared up to step into that role as soon as as soon as the American empire is gone, the Chinese global empire starts. It just seems kind of goofy to me.
They do play their own kind of regional power game though as well, and that kind of goes into the Libya point. Libya was one of the most prosperous countries in Africa during Gaddafi's time in power there, and they were threatening the French franc with their oil and their gas reserves. And interestingly, and this is a finer point, but I hope I'm recalling it correctly, but the point about the Viagra'd up Gaddafi super soldiers committing mass rapes in Libya actually originated from France. And then, of course, it was laundered through international institutions and all that. But obviously, there's a very clear conflict of interest when the country that you're the biggest, opposition to or the biggest threat to is the one that's making up, war propaganda against you. I take big issue with that. But that's all.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, let's watch some more.
This expansionism, it's something that is going to continue to the greatest possible extent, no matter what promises are made or kept. Russia did, of course, make a promise explicitly to respect Ukrainian territorial sovereignty in return for Ukraine giving their nukes back to Russia, and they're fucking around with that at the moment. So, in terms of these agreements, the thing that the reason why I think this paranoia is justified is because Russia is the aggressor, and they threaten nukes over this stuff. They've made allusions to nuclear armaments being used or moved in response to Ukraine becoming a part of NATO, or during the Crimean crisis as well. Like, the United States does not do this. This would be insane for us to do. If we were posturing nuclear weapons now in the modern 21st century in response to what neighboring countries do, they're not even talking about sovereignty.
Weakness, though, wouldn't you say that's the sign of weakness? It's not a sign of strength. The United States doesn't need to do that. Putin needs to do that.
Yeah, but he does have nukes, which it's one of those. It's the sign of weakness from a person with a suicide vest strapped to their chest. They can be as weak as they like as long as they can hold the detonator.
Let me get into the question of intentions, but very briefly, I would point people to the work of Joshua Shifrinson, who really is the guy who went super deep on this, and he makes pretty clear that the U.S. actually did promise not to expand eastward.
I haven't read that particular work. The readings that I've seen haven't led to that. I suppose I'll be forthcoming. I guess my ultimate belief is that I don't really care, um, because at the end of the day, the countries that are part of NATO want to be a part of NATO. If we're respecting territorial sovereignty here, these Balkan states, they don't want to just live next to Russia without some kind of defensive pact protecting them. There's a reason they run to us instead of to Russia. It's not just economic security. They remember what Russia was like during the era of the Soviet Union. I cannot blame them for being touchy about these subjects now. Likewise with Ukraine, the issue is, like, NATO expansion doesn't threaten Russia directly. NATO will never invade Russia. Russia is a nuclear power. It is unfathomable. It can never happen. The only thing NATO meaningfully does is prevent Russia from fucking with their neighbors, which in my mind is something that they shouldn't be doing anyway. It seems like, regardless of promises made, kept, lost, broken, NATO can never really be the aggressor here because NATO has no meaningful capability to engage in violence against Russia, whereas the reverse is true. Russia does have a meaningful ability to engage in violence against countries that aren't a part of NATO. You know what I mean? So in terms of the
That's not the
it's
reverse.
it's difficult to navigate, and for Russia to posture with the nukes, they brought it up during the Crimean thing. They brought it up here. They've brought it up multiple times since the end of the Cold War, and it's always because they're mad they can't bully a neighbor. Like, Jesus, they need to fall in line, and not even Western hegemony. They need to fall in line to not making nuclear threats when they can't invade their neighbor. I feel like that's a reasonable line to fall to. It's a line America makes. We don't threaten to nuke Mexico when they do something we don't like. If for all of Trump's blustering, he never threatened to invade or nuke Mexico because they kept sending cartels of illegals up towards us, which legitimately feels like a very Putin-esque thing that he would try to employ as a way of stirring up national sentiment if he was in comparable circumstances over there.
Well, I guess I think I view Russia as more of a quote unquote normal nation than you might. I do think if there was the equivalent of NATO in Latin America and it started, in South America and was slowly making its way to Central and North America, it wouldn't be out of bounds, I think, for an American leader to threaten some sort of, quote unquote tactical nuclear exchange. And I think ultimately, I guess what I think that gets to the heart of it. I view Putin and Russia as quote unquote normal. I don't view them as quote unquote revisionist. I don't think that they're going to start World War III. I think it's a declining power, a superpower that's not a middle power. And for a lot of domestic political reasons, Putin wants to shore up his authority and shore up Russian prestige for various reasons in ways that I disagree with. But to me, it's very readable. It's not that difficult to understand what's going on, and that's why I don't think
it's understandable. They want territory, right? They want power. They want they
want a sphere of influence.
Yeah.
However you define that, right? And in a world where they basically had a huge one that is shrinking ever more.
It would be like the United States getting angry. People in Puerto Rico were talking about secession, so we'd send a military fleet over there and threaten to nuke anyone who if the United States did that,
done that in a different era of history, we wouldn't do it in 2022.
Well, yeah, yes, that's critical because now we have nukes. There's a very important difference here. We couldn't end the world over a skirmish before, but now we can. If America ever did that, the world would unify in condemnation. Like everyone, I guess, except for American neocons. Whatever they're up to, I'm sure they'd love it, but everyone would criticize this. But oh, Russia threatening nukes because they're mad that they can't do more invasions of their neighbors. I guess that's normal in the sense that I expect countries to act in their geopolitical interests, and the former Soviet bloc has left kind of a vacuum of poverty that they can exploit. But if that's normal, that's a bad kind of normal, right?
It's not good. Yeah, it's not something that I support. But I don't think that, I guess just to put a fine point on it, I don't think that indicates some sort of invasion or war or actual use of nuclear weapons. And I would point to the 58 to 61 Berlin crisis about Soviet atomic blackmail, which this is actually a long-standing tactic in the Soviet toolbox because they are so much weaker than the United States. They've been doing this since the Cold War. Let me, the guy I wrote my first.
They're backed up against the wall. They're dangerous. They're like a wounded animal.
I would look at this book called, or a publication called Soviet Atomic Blackmail and the North Atlantic Alliance from 1957, which basically says everything you need to know about this subject. And the author concludes, if I recall correctly, that it doesn't actually indicate necessarily a desire for nuclear war, but it's a sign of weakness and a sign of like trying to exaggerate a threat in order to get what you want, which is what, not something I would like to do in the world, but this is how international relations functions.
How do we stop it?
Indicative. How do we stop? Like the big question.
We can't. The nuclear threats have to stop. Like that's like the ultimate bad, right? Like everything else.
That is the huge question, right? Like, so the question is some sort of engaged disarmament, a unilateral disarmament, a no first use policy. The reality is, good or bad, no nation's giving up their nukes. Right. So absent the world proletariat revolution, I don't see a step-by-step path to getting rid of nuclear weapons. It really is Prometheus's box.
But we don't have to get rid of nukes, right? We just have to get rid of Russia, because the UK, Germany, France, Spain, they have nukes. This isn't an issue. They don't threaten world peace. We can't get rid of nukes, and Russia will never get rid of their nukes because they know that's the only reason that they haven't been invaded. If Russia didn't have nukes, we would have intervened in there a long time ago. So absent that potential solution, something has to be done to readjust their geopolitical interests to the point that they no longer feel the need to posture and threaten the way that they do. That's the only way out that I see. Invasion can't be done for so many reasons, and they will never agree to get rid of their nuclear weapons because they know they'd then be invaded. So where do we it feels like we have to, I don't know, like I don't think sanctioning can do this. Find a way to like break up their block economically, like cut them off.
I don't think there's an immediate solution. I mean, I think that's the truth. I think there'd have to be developments in world politics before that becomes a feasible reality. At this, I don't think there's a step way to do that. I can't see it, at least. That's why I was joking about the world proletariat revolution, right? You need some gigantic exogenous shock.
It's serious to me.
So when that happens, then we'll figure it out. But I don't think there's an immediate way to do that. I think what can be done, people who are, I actually don't know where you guys are, as someone who's an American citizen who speaks with a voice in American politics, is to basically reduce American influence on the world. And that's what I keep on coming back to, that it's better for people in their own environment, in their own region, to determine what should be done without the United States making decisions for them. Again, not tomorrow, but some sort of legitimate security transition, which makes people in the region have their stakes in their own politics, while also recognizing the United States isn't going to be able to get what it or what a moral person who finds themselves in the United States wants done in the world. One, because morality isn't necessarily universal and people have different beliefs. And two, because I just think historically we don't have the ability to shape politics in that way. It always fails.
Yeah, well, I agree that, there's a degree of subjectivity when it comes to morality. I just don't care what other people think. It's my way, I guess, and my great big $800 billion American military war machine. In terms of like what we can actually do, though, you're right. Intervention doesn't really work usually because it's not like a really bad guy that's doing the thing. It's usually some fucked up incentive structures, and you can't destroy those with bombs. You can destroy people and buildings with bombs. But if there's an incentive for really bad outcomes, I don't think that American military intervention can fix that. Sometimes, I mean, if it really is like it's the bad government, World War II, Germany, Japan, whatever, okay, sure, fine. But for the most part, I don't think that sort of stuff works. I support what we're doing in Taiwan and Ukraine, not because I think America should have a say over Taiwan and Ukraine, but because the people in Taiwan and Ukraine seem to prefer America's hegemonic blanket over China and Russia's respectively. So in deference to their will there, and to a however liberal belief in national sovereignty, I think that they have some right to ask and we have some right to answer. In other cases, though, I mean, we see how this stuff goes. We know what we did in Libya. We know how Syria is looking right now. Afghanistan's doing great, as we all know. 20 years of building democracy. If only we'd spent 40, maybe everything would have worked. So as a broad project, I agree. But I do feel that a conflation of different types of interventionism can sometimes lead to us not opposing interventionism, but rather implicitly supporting Russian or Chinese interventionism, which has far worse outcomes in these specific cases, by way of our abstemiousness. Yes, our abstemiousness, our unwillingness to get our hands dirty.
abstemiousness, I think.
Abstemiousness. Thank you.
But just one point, because I think that's really crucial. If you have the capabilities to participate in a quote unquote good intervention, you have the capabilities to participate in a bad one. And I think the goal, for me at least, is to make sure we don't have those capabilities at all.
That is true. If you have the ability to and have set the precedent for intervention in other situations, you're kind of leaning back and hoping that the powers that be will only implement that power and implement that rationale when it's good to do so. I acknowledge that. I don't think there's a way around that, unfortunately. I guess I would have to hope then that in the cosmic dice that we and other countries roll, we have a better chance of being successful in our behavior than Russia and China would be in their respective situations, assuming that there's a vacuum to be taken advantage of, or a conflict over prosperity in the region. There are probably ways by which you could do that, like, for example, systems of approach. Are you doing this with the overwhelming majority of the people's support, or are you doing this because you agree with some militia group and you disagree with the government? Like, what power base are you building upon? Is the problem you're addressing something that can actually be fixed for the people in that country with military force or with armaments, or is it just something bad is happening and having soldiers there feels like the right thing to do? There are probably ways to streamline that you could eventually arrive at a process where you're more likely to get a good intervention than a bad intervention, but
That's been tried.
Yeah, and America's not going to do it either, because you have to build those processes first. And what I think is moral isn't what the U.S. thinks is geopolitically, prescient. So there's going to be,
Right. So just to point out, historically, there was this big thing called systems analysis in the 50s and the 60s that tried to do that, and I think it's literally ontologically and epistemologically impossible. You can't have the data or the inputs to make that like a semi-automatic decision, which is what you would want. So that leads me then, I want to just make clear how I answer that question, is to look to history. And again, the history is not ambiguous. We fail far more often than we succeed, and it's not even close.
Have you considered the possibility that I might be built different?
maybe you're built different, or we'll construct the perfect system. Just color me skeptical.
No, I understand. At the end of the day, we don't have any direct control over what the United States does militarily anyway. I feel it right to support our involvement in Ukraine. If for no other reason, we don't have boots in the ground in Ukraine, so this isn't even comparable to the kind of intervention we generally talk about. Likewise with Taiwan, we would never risk directly exchanging fire with Russian or Chinese soldiers, because that could be really bad. Really, really bad. In terms of more engaged conflicts where we've actually put boots on the ground, I do think of a very small number of justifiable examples in which our involvement was actually good. Obviously, the easiest one to go back to would be World War II, because nobody likes the Nazis, and so on and so on. And even then we fucked up, because we didn't have to drop the bombs on Japan, and that killed a whole bunch of people. Even that was an arduous path. As Bosnia, some people talk about different elements
here. That's a tough,
right? Yeah, there are edge. Yeah. This is very, very, very blurry instances. Though I will ask though, and I understand this is a question delivered with the simplicity of a child's mind, but I want to know, what metric, if any, would you use to pull apart from your anti-interventionist perspective and say, all right, it's 1940, whatever, we're going to war, we're get in your boats, boys, all right, we're crossing the Atlantic, okay, Adolf's getting an ass whooping. Would you, and of course, this is a very morally loaded question, would you let Hitler live? It's stupid, and the war would have ended without our involvement either way. But conceptually, they didn't know that at the time. We didn't know they weren't going to develop their own atomic weapons in time. We got involved. How would you look at that and say, this is worth our involvement? What is the line? Do you think okay to get there?
Yeah, well, as a Jew, I'm glad Hitler didn't succeed. But I would say,
agreed. Look at that.
I wish you could have the intervention in World War II without the coterminous construction of the American Empire, which is what actually happened in history. So I wish that World War II was used as a moment to build a more democratic global structure than what actually happened, which was to create a structure organized around American armed primacy. That's just simply how I'd phrase it. I find that intervention necessary, but I don't find the construction of the empire, which occurred during World War II and then really took off afterward and was embodied in the international institutions like the UN, the GATT, et cetera, of American hegemony to have been necessary to the intervention.
Okay, I agree with that. Though that doesn't actually tell me what line would have been crossed to justify, right? Because if we're talking death camps here, like in Rojava, things got pretty spicy, you know, with the, you know, a lot of people dying all over the place. Like, where do we, you know, is it like the threat of global domination? Is it allies being invaded? Because, like, personally, you know, if like UK got invaded, like that's a pretty big, you know.
Yeah, it's almost of a different quality because from my perspective, the North Atlantic community is almost like a single polity in a way that other areas of the world aren't. I'm sure you've heard this this argument made about, you know, the Second 30 Years' War, where World War I and World War II are really, you know, part of a civil war within the North Atlantic community. So to me, it strikes it as a little bit of a different quality than you know, intervention, et cetera. But you know, I think it's a difficult question that's probably impossible to disentangle from my own identity and the fact that like I had relatives killed in the Holocaust and that we're all sort of, you know, it's hard for me to disentangle.
It's a loaded, yeah. Like,
no
would you?
Criterion, right? There's no like on this side of the line we don't fight Hitler, and on that side of the line we do fight Hitler. I don't think war making has that sort of simple criterion. This sort of systems approach won't work with it.
It is difficult then because it feels like we leave on the table the ability for good intervention. And of course, a war like World War II would never happen again. If it did, it would be over very, very quickly. You know, it seems like all real conflicts from this point forward are going to be nuclear powers bullying non-nuclear powers, or non-nuclear powers having border disputes with non-nuclear powers. Like, and that's it. Like that. Like, it can't be anything more than that. Short of some kind of mass disarmament, it seems like that's the limit of what we can and can't do. If there was some kind of like, oh, I don't know, like some kind of some warlord who starts from Sudan and just takes like further more and more territories. Like, eventually they would get their hands on nukes as well. I'm pretty sure you can.
All right, I was looking for a natural pausing point there, but that's probably about as good as we're going to get. Want to. Well, actually, I want to make 2 points about this. I'll just make one of them real quick now and then go to you guys and wait for the second one. So the one point I wanted to make now is just that I think that what I was saying earlier about the vibes, I think got much clearer in this last segment since we paused from last time, because the thing that bothers me about his comments about these issues, I think is actually less the substance of the policy positions, although I certainly disagree, you know, with a lot of those. You know, certainly when it comes to, you know, inflicted sanctions that would cause like real misery for ordinary Russians and all that. But it's more the fact that it just, like, there's a lot of we for things that the American empire does in the world, right? You know, like he's clearly there's this overwhelming sense of identification with American military power, the stuff that it does around the world. Like, well, maybe we do bad things, but you know, we should do this and that, and we could just do this. And wouldn't it be great if we did that? And you know, it's it just bugs me on that level, and I think that might seem like I could see somebody who maybe doesn't come from. Sorry,
it's like the Parenti line where he's talking about unconsciously identifying with the country that you're from, to the point where somebody says, we've got to take a step and do something about what we're doing in Nicaragua. So we've got to come in and stop ourselves. That's an interesting and definitely worthwhile point for sure.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I was getting this vibe that there's this strand of American exceptionalism running through almost everything he says in terms of how the US acts as a certain empire and that identification. It reminded me actually, when the late Christopher Hitchens passed, and, then the late Alexander Cockburn, the editor of Counterpunch, once wrote an obituary where he said, despite, pretenses, Hitchens always believed in the therapeutic effects of, American empire and American intervention. And I get that vibe listening, to him. There is this strand of American exceptionalism and running through everything he says, and just the way that he even talks about the United States being unique and how it interacts with its neighbors in Latin America, Mexico, things it would never do. I mean, first of all, I don't think there's a lot of validity to that. If we replicate some of the conditions in Ukraine and put it like in the southern border of Mexico, that the United States shares with Mexico, I could imagine a great deal of American military intervention if what Bessner was saying actually happened, a Russian-Chinese military alliance moving up the southern cone into Mexico, and you had an ethnic enclave of Americans in one part of Mexico, and you had a government in Mexico that was overthrown, and a more Russia-China-friendly government took its place, and there was bombardment of this ethnic enclave in Mexico. I mean, to say that the United States would not intervene militarily or would not do something similar.
I mean, it would most definitely intervene militarily, and it's not at all out of the question that at some point, like especially if there was an element of great power tensions coinciding with whatever it was doing in Mexico, that at some point it would do nuclear saber rattling is definitely not out of outside of the realm of possibility, right? Like that seems like something that could happen. But yeah, it just seems like, he really. I mean, it's funny because I guess I just don't get, like, this is what seems like the thing that seems kind of incoherent to me about his position is that in the first few minutes when they were just sort of doing these like very general kind of first principles, he seemed to be agreeing with Danny that like there's just the American empire shouldn't exist, basically. And then everything, we need to do some kind of drawdown and all this stuff. But then everything since then just has not fit at all with that, or at least it hasn't felt like it's fit with it to me. That, like even when he was talking about the bases, he was like, oh, well, the reason to draw down the bases is that then you can,
do economic warfare against the people we don't like even harder.
Yeah, exactly. Like, it's still assuming that the United States has this dominant role in the world. It's just that we don't need the bases because supposedly they're only vestigial. Like, really, we can just do it all economically. But yeah, that just seems totally wrong. And I think the one reason why all of this is important, that again, I was starting to say, I get that, like, people who are watching us have this conversation who might not come from exactly the same political tradition might not quite get like why that's bothering us, the we thing, like, and whatever. I know we all talk like that sometimes. I certainly do, right? Like it's a very easy thing to fall into, that remember what we did, whatever. But like he's doing it so much, and he's doing it from like this perspective. It's like, oh, what should we do? And I think that, I mean, so Shakab mentions Christopher Hitchens. By the way, I disagree with Cockburn. I think that Hitchens was genuinely anti-imperialist in like the 80s, and the 90s were kind of a transitional period where he was starting to warm up to American power. And then the 2000s, obviously he was full bore, like enthusiastic warmonger. But I wrote a book about the guy. People can check it out. But having gotten the plug in, I will say, that where it does remind me of late Hitchens is that there's this kind of conflation that people will do sometimes. And late Hitchens like did this constantly, of internationalism with interventionism. That people say, oh, what about like, you don't want to be like an isolationist, do you? Whatever happened to internationalism? Whereby what they mean by internationalism is just sort of a vague sense of caring about what happens to people in other places. And of course, that is a common thread between left internationalism and liberal interventionism. But left internationalism and liberal interventionism are two totally different things, right? Like, historically, the main thing that leftist parties meant by internationalism was that they would oppose like if their countries went to war with each other, they would each oppose the policy of their own government. They would refuse to, fight and kill each other like that. And even in the Spanish Civil War, right, where of course, the left, the global left correctly supported the Republic against the fascists, by and large, socialists and communists in the West were not actually calling on the United States to militarily intervene on behalf of the Republic. They weren't really calling the U.S. to do much of anything except for letting them send arms to Spain and fight in Spain and all of that stuff. So I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah. And if I could just make a couple points to like bring up some things that were said there. The second part to Vaush being kind of owned or schooled on, we didn't promise this. Vaush does a big stutter. I haven't read that from what I've seen, my readings. Well, I'll be frank. I don't care. I mean, that's the only. That's the true basis of where he's coming from on this. That he doesn't actually care about the material fact of that. Sadly, and he says NATO can never be the aggressor. Obviously Russia doesn't see it that way, and if we're trying to avoid any backlash from Russia, then that's important in our calculation of NATO action. He said that the United States wouldn't coup a country trying to be independent or autonomous, or if we did, then the world would unite against us. I mean, he mentions Honduras, but we literally broke Panama off from Colombia to create a canal there. He said that Putin and Russia are like backed up against a wall. They're like a wounded animal. So that just supports the point of, so why would you arm Ukraine and push NATO east and continue with these, provocative actions and everything else. And he said that nuclear threats have to stop. Definitely, I think that's good. Nuclear saber rattling is a lot more dangerous than regular. But of course, though, Zelensky floated possibly getting nukes, and Ukraine has the old Russian tech, so it's really a possibility. And he said that America doesn't have to get rid of nukes. Countries don't have to get rid of nukes. Only quote unquote crazy countries should. But we saw when Gaddafi gave up his weapons, that's when he got invaded. And North Korea now has no reason to actually give up their weapons because they've seen the example of Libya. Obviously, the world will never get rid of nukes until the only country in the world that used them gets rid of theirs. And that kind of goes into nuclear disarmament and drawing down, which is Danny's point in the first place. And obviously, we should re-enter the missile treaty that we pulled out of with Russia. That's really important. And so, like, a mutual drawdown would actually generally be a very good thing and would generally really warm tensions between the two countries. And
yeah, no question. I guess to be fair, I'm trying to remember when he said that comment about the world united against us. I don't know if that was with regard to a coup, or whether that was with regard to the scenario where the United States is making nuclear threats. It's less crazy if it's the second one, because that hasn't happened lately. But obviously the coup thing would be completely insane because you don't have to go back to Panama and Colombia or any of these like older things. Like you don't even have to go back to the Cold War. You could just look at the you could just stay entirely in the 21st century, right? And see that there's the openly US backed attempted and like we don't even have to talk about stuff like Maidan, which is like again in lots of ways played out more like a popular uprising than a classical military coup, but it was against the democratic government, and as you point out, the population Chicago pointed out the population is deeply split on that, right? So it's if not a clear case of a coup, also maybe not a clear case of not a coup, and you don't even have to go to examples as ambiguous as that, though. Right? You could just, classic military coup in Venezuela in 2002. The United States openly supported Haiti in 2004. U.S. Marines actually took the democratically elected president, escorted him out of the country, and as to depose him.
And even the recent Haiti coup, the U.S. envoy actually quit because there was an investigation into the president himself with regards to the coup situation, and he fired the prosecutor that was investigating it, and that prompted the U.S. Ambassador to Haiti to just resign over that. So obviously, there's some wrongdoing going on there as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't. When it came out that the assassination in Haiti, that there was a Miami connection there, that was the least surprising possible thing that could have come out about it, right?
And Colombia connection. Apparently, the assassins were, they had a blueprint of the place, the actions they took, and they were speaking Spanish, and it sounded like they had a Colombian accent, according to people recording live there or listening to it anyway.
Yeah, and again, like totally non-speculative examples. Honduras in 2009. Hillary Clinton brags in the first edition of her autobiography that she diplomatically intervened to stop the democratically elected president from coming back into power. That Bolivia, it just like the list goes on. Yeah. I mean, and this is all just in the 21st century. So yeah, if it's the coup claim, that's nuts. I think he might have just meant it with the nuclear threats, in which case it's less crazy. Although it's also, even there, it's not clear to me why he thinks that that's true, right? Because the United States has done nutty things around the world without the world uniting against it in any meaningful way. I mean, that's not just like
uniting with it, even.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
sure. Coalition of the willing. That's a like not the world, but I mean a smattering of countries around the world, and that other countries would make speeches in the UN, but I mean certainly wouldn't do anything beyond that to stop it. But yeah, I think that what it comes down to. So I think that.
And interestingly, sorry, just brief point.
Please.
When he resorts to the meme of "Have you considered it if I'm built different?" I mean, there's the response of like, "Hey, why would you even address something like that? That's not worth bringing up." But I think it actually points to the point that he's arguing from a position of American exceptionalism.
Yeah, I mean, it was a jokey thing to say. I don't know how much to read into that, but it's also, it's also a jokey. I mean, it's a jokey deflection, right? Because I think the point that Danny was making to him was, I think,
rock solid. Yeah,
rock solid.
U.S. overwhelmingly, the interventions cause a rise in extremism, rise in all of the things that we say that we're going to intervene to stop.
Yeah, and so the idea that there's just a way of you can do this systems analysis, you can just automate, what counts as, in other words, what he's really arguing against at that point is oh, come on, you're going to do the good interventionism, good luck with that. That's what's the reason to think that this time will be different, right? And I think that's just a correct thing to say. I mean, I think really. I mean, we'll watch the last 20 minutes, whatever we've got left. But I mean, I think it seems to me that what it really comes down to is that Danny, it seems to me, has a clear position. You can agree with it or disagree with it, but it's a clear position, which is that the United States should not be playing this globally hegemonic, world policeman, kind of imperial role. And, not overnight, right? That sure, there are all kinds of, you don't want to just leave chaos behind you, but so it could be a gradual process, but we should be drawing it down and wrapping it up and bringing it home. Even knowing that sometimes, right, the consequences of that are not going to be universally good because the world's a complicated and messy place. But overall, we would be better just not playing that role. And so the point he was making about the regions, which I think Vaush didn't quite understand, I think he was misreading the point, is it wasn't oh, you should do, the United States should do whatever people in some area want it to do, right? That wasn't the point. The point was that instead of having a world where there's a single, hegemonic global master, instead you should have a world where maybe there are different regional powers and and they things that are balancing against each other and people there's no single power that is holding the level of global power that the United States is. And of course that means that, sure, sometimes, that like if we're just not interfering in other regions around the world, I mean, not that we even want the United States to, be Monroe Doctrine about our own region, but like,
there may be civil conflict, there may be regional conflict, who knows? But I mean, we're not in a position to support Saudi Arabia having a sphere of influence over Yemen to bomb and blockade and starve them. And,
yeah, no, exactly. And so his point was that, sure, sometimes the consequences will be bad, because if the United States is not projecting power in like totally different parts of the world outside of the, North America, then, all right, that means that like sometimes there'll be bad things that'll go on other places that the United States won't stop. But his point about how people in regions know best what's for that region was that in a world where there isn't this single power that has this level of global dominance, that, sure, there are bad things that'll happen in a world where it's not, because whatever's going on in that region will just be left to happen. But there are also a lot of bad things that will happen specifically because the U.S. is playing this role. So even from a totally calculated utilitarian perspective, where we just leave out every other point we could make about this, the question is, which of those is going to lead to predictably worse outcomes? And I think Danny's point about the regions was just, yeah, generally speaking, we shouldn't want a world where there's one power that's dictating what happens everywhere else, because generally speaking, there's no reason to think that power is going to know better what's best for everybody all around the world than people within regions know what's best for that region. I think that was his point about that.
Yeah, and I'll just also quickly add that, his claim that if the United States doesn't intervene with its hegemony in a particular region, then some other power will. It lacks novelty. During the Cold War, the United States government used this rationale to invade and overthrow governments in Latin America and many other places, and under the pretext that as, corrupt or as brutal the authoritarian governments were that replaced some of the democratically elected governments, in the absence of that, the Soviet presence and the Soviet threat would be even worse. And, this was done obviously in regions where the Soviet Union hadn't actually intervened initially at all. I mean, in Guatemala, the overthrow of the Arbenz government, not a communist government, not a Stalinist, not a Soviet-aligned government when it was overthrown. But again, this was all justified on the grounds that while, the replacement might be bad if we didn't do this, the Soviet alternative is even worse. It's really just, a Cold War talking point. And so, that should be pointed out.
Yeah, saying that they're puppets of the USSR. There's a fantastic book called Killing Hope by William Bloom, former CIA, big shot, whatever. But he goes in chapter by chapter after the Cold War, all the U.S. interventions, and a lot of them, they're just neutralist governments. But in the same kind of language of moral panic, being a neutralist is not enough. You need to be ardently anti-USSR and pro-US and pro-West. Otherwise, you're just an unwitting stooge, and you're waiting to eventually fall into their lap. So,
yeah, no, I think that's right. And I saw somebody say, oh, but given what I just said, what about what just happened in Russia, Ukraine? It's like, okay, no, let's do that. Let's actually play out the thought experiment, right? What would happen? I think most likely what would happen is that Russia, yes, would be able to bully Ukraine more effectively in the first place, right? Without this level of conflict, and that you could get Finlandization from that, right? That there's a kind of that there are limits to the ability of Ukraine to align itself with any other power, that that it has to because it has to stay on the good side of Russian foreign policy. But the question is that outcome worse than what's happening right now? And it's at the very least not obvious to me that it is. And I mean, obviously my preference as a socialist and an internationalist would be for a world where no country is in a position to bully any other country, right? Everybody's just sort of, living together in a completely, peaceful way on equal democratic footing with some sort of democratic global institutions to mediate any conflicts that do have in a way that would have much more legitimacy, than anything that exists right now. But given that we don't live in that world, the power of some countries is going to be some kind of limit on what other countries can get away with doing. That, I mean, forget Mexico. If Canada, wanted to enter into a military pact with, Iran and China tomorrow, I mean, one of the reasons they would never do that is that, like, they would not want to piss off, the beast, just below them. And again, that's bad. I don't like that. I would prefer to live in a world with some sort of democratic global institutions, everybody's living in peace with each other, etc. But given that we don't, is that a good enough reason? Like, given that we don't, are we better off with an American global empire without it? And I still think without it. I think even the former Soviet Union is better off without an American global empire. Last point I did want to make before we go back to the debate is just that. Oh yeah. So I think this might have been what Shakot was talking about before, but maybe I read it differently. But Vaush made this weird comment about. He actually made it a couple times, but it was most recently in the chunk that we just watched about how opposing all U.S. interventionism ends up being supporting other people's interventionism through our abstemiousness. And I think that's actually really, really importantly wrong and dangerous, because this is the exact equation that interventionists always try to make, right? That, I mean, again, go back to late Hitchens. If you're against the invasion of Iraq, you're objectively pro-Saddam.
It's
right?
different this time, guys. Look, he has WMDs. Look, he's gassing his own people. Look, he's doing mass rape. All the trotted out, and this goes back to the British administration of India, where they said that they have to intervene in India because they need to support the women there who don't have rights or whatever.
Yeah,
and look at the result of that.
I mean, it's possible to the fact that you don't support American and whatever. I mean, like, sure, do I think it's absolutely wrong ever under any circumstances to like ever give anybody guns or whatever? Like, we can talk about different things that you could do, but like, just as a principle, right? Forget the application for a second. Just as a principle, it's a shitty principle. Like, just because you don't support the United States doing something in response to something doesn't mean you support the original thing, right? You could be against the invasion of Iraq without being pro Saddam, right? You could be, like whatever. You could be, you could have a problem with, with Reagan's foreign policy in the 80s without being a fan of Brezhnev's foreign policy in the 80s, right? It's actually, possible to be against one bad thing, right, without being in favor of a competing bad thing. Yeah. And I think, as simple-minded as that sounds, I think it's just a really important point, because even though I know Vaush is not, I think, advocating like actual like boots on the ground warfare or anything here, I think the structure of the claim he's making, that if we don't step in to do something about the bad interventions that other powers are doing, then by doing that we're essentially supporting. It's like, no, we're not, right? Yeah. Like you're not, like, just not wanting the United States to bomb Iraq doesn't mean that you implicitly support the invasion of Kuwait. Like, you can, I think that equation, that like you're supporting something if you don't support the American empire stepping in to do something about it, I think is just I mean, I think it's a terrible logical leap, and I think it's just terrible politics. I don't want to think that way. I think thinking that way is how you end up, right? So I know.
And this, just going back really quick, this is the language of moral panic. This is panic-driven scapegoating, and the history of recurring patterns of persecution. And there's a great book from Ben Debney called The Oldest Trick in the Book, where he talks about moral rhetoric, and he kind of makes the case of McCarthyism had this structure, the witch hunts had this structure, the War of Terror had this structure, and that's the language. You're either with us or you're against us. You cannot be neutral. If you're neutral, you're against us. You need to be extremely supportive of what we're doing. If you don't go along with what we're doing, if you ask questions even, then you're a suspect. And it's very strong tribalism, and it's done with, by rulers when they're losing grip of power, is the thesis of the book, basically. But in this case, when we're going into war, it's used to manufacture consent of the population and to kind of enforce a kind of herd mentality to go along with the leaders that are persecuting the war. So
Yeah.
well said.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's like, actually, I think I'm also getting this from Danny, but he doesn't say it in this debate, but he said it elsewhere, that it's like, so, Mark Fisher talked about capitalist realism, meaning that you just see capitalist economics, or even really what Fisher's talking about is kind of like late capitalist, kind of neoliberal economics, so thoroughly pervades your sense of reality, you can't imagine anything else. And so it just doesn't even seem like something you complain about, because that's just how the world is. That I think I've heard Danny make this comparison. It's like imperialist realism, right? That we just, having America play this imperialist world policeman role is so ingrained that you just can't imagine your way out of it, right? That it's always like, so the questions are, oh, should the United States stop such and such from happening? Or is it cool that such and such happens? It's like, well, no. I mean, it could just be neither one. It could be a horrible crime that such and such is happening, but also the United States shouldn't be getting involved to try to stop it, because it's a bad thing. Certainly bad for American society. They're whatever. Don't come at me, MMT people. I think there are real guns and butter trade-offs, and it's a bad thing for the world as a whole. That for the United States to play this role. I mean, not always, not in every case, but like overall, it's a bad world system. We shouldn't have it. Okay. Anyway, let's go back and watch the last chunk, and then we can all kind of wrap up. Unless, Shakad, is there anything you want to add right now? Okay. All right.
Just buy those, depending on who's selling. So you couldn't even really do anything about that if they amassed enough power to be able. I don't know.
I think like the way that I fall ultimately on these issues is that I think we have to work toward the creation of a genuinely democratic, genuinely international institution that we don't have yet. And I wouldn't even know how to build before we could actually basically get rid of the international anarchy I was talking about earlier, and before we are able to make genuinely legitimate decisions about war. Otherwise, you will wind up becoming like a Michael Walzer or Michael Ignatieff, where you like develop these arguments in favor of just war that wind up being the handmaiden of American military supremacy and empire, which is not the world that I want to build. I'm a humanist. I think we're all equally human, and we have to build institutions that reflect that philosophy. Ultimately, now there will be people like a Hitler who are anti-humanists, right? And so that runs up against that as well. And like, what if they don't abide by the humanist system? And what do you do then? And I think you ultimately have to go on democratic deliberation. That's what we've got, a genuinely democratic deliberation where various forms of inequality don't shape the discussion, which is utopian, but but this is what we should be building toward, I think.
It's a dream.
I'm just going to quickly interject here and say that we're kind of approaching the hour and a half mark. Did you?
I was going to say final point, actually, because I feel like we've resolved the well, perhaps not resolved, but at least arrived at and concluded and drawn through our major points and disagreements. Then I'll just conclude here. Then I guess I don't know what metrics, if any, could be used to determine good interventionism versus bad interventionism. I feel like boots on the ground is a much higher bar than just providing military aid. In terms of the broader, American empire and the influence that it has, and the alternatives to American empire, which, in my perspective, however it may be informed, would be Russian or Chinese empire presently. I guess the world that I envision, the one that is the most peaceful, that does not have a proletarian revolution in its recent past, tragically, would be one in which everyone is so bound by mutual trade obligations that nobody could ever benefit from a war. That everyone, no matter what country you mess with, no matter who you bomb or who you depose, no matter what happens, you're going to end up fucking some element of your economy over, because they were the ones who gave you your lumber or your cocoa beans or your natural gas or this, that, the other. And, ideally, you would just disincentivize it. It's all about incentive structures. America is always going to stand to benefit from engagement in imperialist action as long as we lose nothing from our behavior in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, wherever else, because they have nothing. They have dirt scraps and metal scraps that we dropped on them from drones. So, What's the harm of killing people there? None. They aren't relevant to our economic production at all. And if we could build the world up, in a way, this is the subtle peacekeeping of neocolonialism, because as horrible, as monstrous as it has been, if nothing else, the IMF and the World Bank's mission of making the world subservient to American business interests also means the countries which are made subservient are valuable to us in some way, valuable to us as slaves, I guess, in a analogous sense. And that means that there is some interest in ensuring that their infrastructural abilities are not destroyed, because that would hurt us. That's not the best outcome. I don't want the world to be kept peaceful because there's one master and 200 or so slaves. But I think that general trend, economic codependence, that's the idea. So I guess we can hope for that. I don't know. Maybe we just need to do for Russia what Japan did to America. Okay, we need to get them hooked on anime and Nintendo. Okay, we just get them hooked, and then we need Tetris remakes, and we can just mutual cultural exchange, and both governments are like, we both get 4 billion a year from this, whatever. That's the goal. Okay, we need a Russian Nintendo. They're making Stalker no, that's in Ukraine. Shit, they made Pathologic. We need to fund the Pathologic 2 DLC. Get them in. There we go.
Let me I'll have this very, very final point. I think the problem is that these things are systems. So you won't ever be able to be sure to prevent it on the ground and only do one form of military aid or assistance. These things go together. And it's systemic, so you can't just block one or take out one. That's my understanding of how these work. Let me actually just close the window here. Sorry, guys. It'll be 1 sec.
I opened that. It was a debate tactic on my part.
The blinding light that came in.
Yeah, to throw him off his game.
We did receive a very large amount of questions, and don't worry, Daniel, I'm going to give you a final chance. I'm just going to say to everyone who's been asking about a certain Coconut Island or a General Alden, unfortunately, I will not be fielding those questions at this time.
Can I have one serious debate? I swear to God.
But I will say there was a surplus of both. So yes, message received. Anyways, Daniel, you can get a final statement.
Oh, no, that was it. I'm done.
Oh, all right then. Okay, well, I will move on.
Final statement ever.
Yes, it's over. Goodbye. Yeah. Oh, hopefully not.
All right, try to keep the responses, because I did get a lot of questions. So I'll just filter through some of the best ones.
I'll be expedient.
Quick, expedient answers to all of them. First one to Daniel. Where do you draw the line on what's acceptable for U.S. intervention or not? You like D-Day, right?
Oh,
we just had this. We just had this discussion.
But I thought maybe the D-Day part would be the one that you'd want to address. But if you want to skip that,
I love D-Day. It's the greatest.
All right. To Vaush, why is Putin bad and Saudi Arabia good?
I don't think Saudi Arabia is good. I take great issue with our involvement in Saudi Arabia. By the way, if you want proof to my point, the reason why Saudi Arabia is butt buddies with us and isn't, say, for example, a smoking crater is because of OPEC. All right, we rely on them for our oil. If we didn't have economic codependence, and they rely on us too because we buy their oil, then we already would have found 16 reasons to bring democracy to Saudi Arabia. Okay, so yeah. Oof.
Ask Danny what he thinks about the Budapest Treaty that has been signed in exchange for the disarmament of nukes in Ukraine.
Don't know enough about it, but any disarmament of nukes is generally good by my end. We have such an incredible amount of nuclear weapons on this planet. It's really striking that they've never really been used, except Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which was awful enough, but there haven't been large-scale nuclear exchanges. It's really amazing. I think we underappreciate how amazing that truly is.
Yeah.
We've been like 5 minutes to midnight on the clock for a while. Yeah. Vaush, how can you acknowledge the purpose that China has with their military base in Djibouti without recognizing the U.S. does it just to the tune of 700 times more?
No, I do. I'm just saying, I think the only reason we're different is because we're more powerful and got a head start. I think that given the same access to resources that we had, the time that we have, they will fill our space. If America stopped existing, they would do what we did, sometimes more cruelly, sometimes less, but the outcome ultimately would be comparable. Now, obviously, he and I disagree on that, but I that's why I think it's important to always
Okay, we usually skip the Q&A. I was keeping this going for a couple minutes because it was interesting, but I also think this is a good moment to stop on because I think there was some doubt earlier I saw in the chat about what point he was making with that Djibouti base, and I think he just said, right, that like it was weird because like he was like, oh no, I know it's just one, it's not comparable, but then he said it was evidence that if the United States global empire ended, then there would just be a Chinese-dominated global world order. And again, that just seems like, I mean, I've got to say, just like farcically weak evidence for that.
Yeah, for sure. It's, I mean, at least this debate didn't have Vaush telling his guests to shut up while he read Wikipedia. He did do a good job about being, like pretty charitable and good faith and everything. Yeah, I think the point about that Bessner made about just war arguments leading to supporters of that being the handmaiden of U.S. empire building is very profound, very deep and accurate point. That kind of rhetoric of supporting U.S. military interventionism, or at least thinking that it's better than alternatives, which it's not clear that there would be immediate alternatives in the way that we've already discussed. Yeah.
I'll just also say though, his point about how there won't be any kind of overt military conflict so long as all nations are interdependent on one another for trade is a very type of conservative position, which would lock a lot of developing countries into a certain role of being primary commodity producers, and that is really the U.S. Model of hegemony. Certain countries are relegated to this economic role of supplying industrial nations with the raw materials on favorable terms, and when they try to break out of that and chart some independent course of development, then you might get things like coups or intervention, etc. But I don't see it's not really any kind of a radical take, or really not something that we should be striving toward, to just argue that so long as nations fulfill a certain role in they're in the global economy when it comes to international trade, based on a model that really just benefits the large industrial powers, that that should be accepted so long as there's no overt type of military intervention and conflict, especially when that entails usually just well-established companies exerting their dominance throughout those different regions. So it's certainly not a model that should be just strived for.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. I guess I did just have some, and like I said, we usually skip the Q&A, and it's already after 11:30, so we could skip the last few questions. But I guess maybe my last thought about this, and then you guys can kind of wrap up, is I also saw somebody saying, I think a couple times, maybe a couple people, certainly one person a couple times, saying in the chat that Danny was being less precise than Vaush, and I understand why they're saying that. I've actually been thinking about that. I think I know what they mean, but I think they're sort of understanding that wrong, right? In other words, I think it is true that Danny spent a lot more time talking in terms of general principles and sort of like view from 10,000 feet analysis. Whereas Vaush was much more focused on, okay, but should we, do this in Ukraine, or should we do that?
But Ukraine wants to join NATO, so
yeah, exactly, right. And it was like all very focused on the details of the situation, whereas what Danny was saying wasn't. But I think that's not like, that's not just like one of them being a more abstract or precise person than the other. I think that's a function of the positions they're taking. That Vaush is just starting from the assumption that the question is, well, the U.S. is going to play this role, so what should we do, right? Like should we do this or that or the other thing to stop this from happening, or from to whatever, to take the sharp edges off the situation. Whereas I think Danny is asking a different question. He's staking out a fundamentally different position, which is, I've got to say, like pretty much for anybody who watched that Joe Rogan conversation, I think it was like literally like the last 30 seconds before he asked me where to like plug the website and stuff, is that I don't want the United States to play this role in the world. That if there's like any conflict anywhere, the United States is automatically like a player in the conflict. I think that's I think that's bad for any number of reasons, including the fact that, again, I do believe that there are guns versus butter trade-offs, and I mean, it's actually kind of a funny moment because in like a weird way, like there's like a second there where like Joe Rogan's outflanking me from the left because I'm like, look, I know that even if we wrapped up all the military bases and everything, it wouldn't pay for everything that I want. He was like, I don't know, it would pay for a lot, right? Like it's like, yeah, he's right. It would pay for a lot, and that is one important reason why it's bad for the United States to have this global imperial posture. And it's also, I mean, I think, God, after the last couple of decades, I don't see how anybody, it seems very hard to argue that it's bad for the world, right? After Iraq and Afghanistan and et cetera, right? So it's like, so if you're just taking it for granted that we're going to do this, then these very fine-grained questions that Vaush wants to ask, right, about should we do this or that thing make a lot of sense. I'm not saying there's no value to engage with him on that level, right? But like, I do think that I do like Danny's point, which is why I think he was doing it this at a slightly more abstract level, which is, okay, but like, should we make that fundamental assumption?
Yeah, and you really hit on it there. I was actually getting ready to point out that that's a big issue that I have with Vaush's analysis of things, is that he does act like these things are inevitabilities of history and takes them for granted. And I don't really see that as being the case at all. And, if you do kind of take for granted, so for example, Russia's, imperial ambitions, aggressions, and, like we talked about earlier, Putin being the reincarnation of Hitler and Stalin combined, then, it is going to lead you to a lot of those conclusions that he has and those beliefs. And I understand why somebody like that, with those assumptions would have those beliefs. But I just personally, I don't share them. I don't think that there's very good evidence for them. Although there isn't none, of course. There is some, but I just don't think that it's, very compelling on the overall.
Yeah, I mean, especially with this conflict, I mean, whatever you say about Putin, he came of age, during the Cold War. He was in the KGB. He saw the Soviet Union dissolve. He has to know that, imperial overstretch played some part in that, the unsustainable war in Afghanistan. And he miscalculated in the case of Ukraine. He thought probably because of the large ethnic Russian component that it would be a very quick invasion. They could install a new government, withdraw, and then, have support from the population. But that was a miscalculation. The idea that this was ever some part of a broader plan to extend the borders of Russia all the way up to Germany, which is something that Vaush talks about, is not something that is, as was mentioned, that there's a lot of evidence for, nor is it something that Putin would, I believe, ever want to attempt to try, given his background and his role in the former Soviet Union. So there's just not a lot of evidence for that.
That just seems like a really cartoonish view of what's going on here, right? I mean, that's like, again, it's like saying that I don't even know what the equivalent would be, right? That that like if if Iraq hadn't been kicked out of Kuwait, then before you know it, right? It's like, they're whatever, like the Iraqi Republican Guard is like marching into Cairo or something. It's like, just because people do bad and morally grotesque and aggressive things, right, doesn't mean that like every single power in every single context like has these like crazy ambitions, or is in any position to carry them out, or even if it did, or that like, yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, I don't think it's or like whatever. I mean, like even the I mean, look, the United States invaded Iraq, and nobody kicked us out of us. Nobody kicked us out of Iraq, and we just did it, right? And then, but then, like, despite the fact that we've done decades and decades of saber rattling with Iran, right? The United States hasn't even invaded Iran, right? Why? Because we got bogged down, and it would have been like, even like really cynical, disgusting imperial war planners in the United States would know that would be like a crazy overstretch to try to take that on, right? And if you can understand that, you should be able to understand by analogy why a much smaller power with a much smaller economy with much less like military capacity is not like, yeah, even if it successfully, conquers Ukraine, I mean, that doesn't mean it's going to go to like what is like that suddenly like Germany is going to be under threat from Russia. That doesn't make any sense to me.
And I think if I could just make this point, going back to World War II, it is an instructive case because the geography, the topography of that area leading into Russia is very flat, very difficult to defend land that kind of widens out in a funnel shape. So on the west end of Ukraine is actually where it begins to funnel open into Russia, and that was the great difficulty in World War II, the fights over all that flat land and holding such a wide point of contact. And so the more broadly that expands, the more difficult it becomes to fight against intrusion into Russia. So I think that's also an important point in Russia's security concerns about potential military aggression, is if you do have this on the ground conflict that it opens up into, that's a very strategic area for them.
Yeah, exactly, right. And again, that like the Iraq example is not like Saddam Hussein was too good a person to do that, right? It's that I mean, he's a monster. It's that like that would not have been something that would have been in the capacity of the Iraqi military, and that just in purely cynical self-interested terms, right? It would not have served him to try to do that. And you can, and again, like George W. Bush launched 2 invasions of 2 different countries, and so it's like in some ways, like you can make an even better case there, right? Than in the Putin thing. It's like, oh my God, look at him, right? Like it's where's it going to stop? But it's like no, but then like even without a rival power pushing back, I mean, it's just like even the American imperial military machine does have limits to what it can accomplish at any given time. I certainly don't know why anyone would think that, at this point, a distinctly second-rate world power like Russia wouldn't have limits to what it could accomplish.
Yeah, and there's no weapon which will break human spirit. What was interesting too.
Which actually just to jump on that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is a really significant point. I mean, this is why, I think that I really worry about seeing people demonize like peace negotiations as, surrender or whatever, because at this point, what are the options, right? Like either, right, there's some sort of negotiated settlement, or else what? I mean, like,
we need an off ramp to the conflict for sure.
Yeah,
we need diplomacy.
Yeah, because if not, right? I mean, what's the alternative? Like, because if I mean, let's say that the war is successful, which still like in a short-term sense is successful in the same way that Afghanistan and Iraq wars were successful. Then what's happening? It's going to be the same thing, right? I mean, this is going to be like this is. I mean, it's not like Russia could just rule over Ukraine without long-term insurgency. I don't think that's a realistic possibility at this point. So either there's just going to be like decades of bloodshed and chaos there, or there's going to be some kind of negotiated settlement. And I don't know. I mean, like even if it's one that is certainly not one that that the Ukrainian government would have preferred and would have done before the war. I mean, that's got to be the better option.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think it exposes the fragility of empire. All the stories of the discrimination at the border of Poland against black immigrants trying to come in and just saying this is for white Ukrainians only, and everybody on the news kind of saying this is different. These are people that you might have gone to a frat party with or whatever. So this isn't Afghanistan. This isn't Syria. These people have lives. These people are civilized. I mean, really should be an eye-opening moment for a lot of people. I would hope, at least.
Yep. All right, guys. Well, this is fun, but it is about a quarter to midnight, much like the nuclear clock. So we should probably wrap it up there. Either of you guys have anything before we go?
No, just thanks so much for inviting me. And Ben, I've been a fan of your work for a while, so it's great to finally meet you and actually talk to you. So thank you. It's been a pleasure, and I really enjoyed this.
All right. Well,
Yeah.
thank you for coming on. This is great.
And I'll just sign off by saying, liberals, don't let yourself be outflanked on the left by Pat Buchanan and Henry fucking Kissinger. We need to, get rid of NATO, get rid of the IMF, and shout out to Young, Damien Ahmed, Brianna, Adam, Corey, Michael, Pogan, Brent, and everyone else watching.
All right. Sounds good, guys. We'll be back on Monday. We are going to reunite the authors of Myth and Mayhem, Leftist Critique of Jordan Peterson, because Peterson is once again roaming the world, and we're a little worried about his state of mind. So we want to check up on him. So that's going to be Matt McManus, Marion Trejo, and Conrad Hamilton coming up on Monday. We'll see everybody there. Left is best.